Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong, and this is a special lecture for patrons, Doorways in Time, the Great Archaeological Discoveries, Part 8, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this lecture will be brought to you by the letter V. So just to give a very brief and incomplete summary, the Dead Sea Scrolls, roughly speaking, are a collection of several hundred ancient Hebrew texts discovered in the 1940s and 50s, which had been stowed away in ceramic jars and hidden in caves in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea. The scrolls are among the most historically and religiously significant archaeological finds of all time, revolutionizing much of the history of Judaism and Christianity. It's very hard to summarize why they are so important, but just to give an initial foretaste, I'd like to read to you a passage from the Bible. And specifically it comes from the Revised Standard Version translation of the Bible. And the Revised Standard Version was first published in 1952 by the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States. And it aims to be a critically rigorous version of the Bible, based on up-to-date translations of the earliest available versions of the various biblical books. And Protestant Christian churches in the United States wanted to create an accurate text which would avoid corruptions and errors that might have crept into the biblical text over the course of centuries. So specifically, I'll read to you a passage from the first book of Samuel, chapter 10. And this chapter describes the prophet Samuel anointing the tribal war commander Saul as the first king of the Israelites. And the chapter ends by noting that some Israelite leaders refused to recognize Saul as king. And this final verse reads, quote, "But some worthless fellows said, 'How can this man save us?' And they despised him, and brought him no present, but he held his peace." End quote. Then if we turn the page to the beginning of the next chapter, chapter 11, it reads, quote, "Then Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, 'Make a treaty with us, and we will serve you.'" Now, you might notice, as many people have over the years, that this transition is rather abrupt. We suddenly change from speaking about Saul and his leadership of the Israelites to what seems to be a totally separate incident in a different place. And we have to ask, who is this Nahash? Where is Jabesh? And why is Nahash besieging it? Nahash might possibly be a ruler. This passage is unusual in the Hebrew Bible in that this personage is not introduced with his title, so we have a better sense of who he is. And then if we keep going, it gets even weirder. So the second verse reads, quote, "But Nahash the Ammonite said to them, 'On this condition I will make a treaty with you, that I gouge out all your right eyes, and thus put disgrace upon all Israel.' The elders of Jabesh said to him, 'Give us 7 days' respite, that we may send messengers through all the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to save us, we will give ourselves up to you.'" End quote. So now we have to ask, where does this bizarre eye-gouging thing come from? And why do the people of Jabesh want to reach out to Israel for help? Well, now with all of these questions in mind, suppose that we look instead at the new Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which was published by the same institute in 1989. And here, if we look again at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 10, we see the same passage saying that Saul has been anointed king, but not all the Israelites accept or pay tribute to him. But then after that, there is a whole other paragraph, which reads, quote, "Now Nahash, king of the Ammonites, had been grievously oppressing the Gadites and the Reubenites. He would gouge out the right eye of each of them, and would not grant Israel a deliverer. No one was left of the Israelites across the Jordan whose right eye Nahash, king of the Ammonites, had not gouged out. But there were 7,000 men who had escaped from the Ammonites and had entered Jabesh Gilead." And then the next chapter begins by saying, quote, "About a month later, Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead." So now, in this completely new paragraph that appears in the book of Samuel, we have some context. Who is Nahash? He's the king of the Ammonites, so naturally he's in command of their armies. Where is this war happening? It's east of the Jordan. Why is Nahash besieging Jabesh? Because there are Israelites taking shelter there. Why this reference to eye gouging? Because it was a mark of defeat and shame that the Ammonites had inflicted upon their Israelite enemies. And it also tells us why Israel would be a natural place for Jabeshites to seek out allies. This was all part of a war upon the Israelites living east of the Jordan. So, these problems of this abrupt transition and this lack of context seems to have been solved. But where did the editors and publishers of the New Revised Standard Version of 1989 get this passage from? Did they simply make it up, just based on the context around it? No, certainly not. These are devout Christians, many of them fundamentalist, and they would never add passages into the Bible. So where did this passage come from? It came from the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically a document called 4Q Samuel A, meaning the first version of the book of Samuel found in Qumran cave number 4. And this text found in this cave in the area called Qumran broadly resembles the traditional Hebrew text of the book of Samuel, but with several differences. The biggest one being this paragraph, which is missing from the received traditional biblical text. Moreover, this passage agrees with the later chronicle called Antiquities of the Jews, written by the Jewish chronicler Josephus, who probably had this more complete text of the book of Samuel in his hands when he wrote his chronicle. So hence, Protestant Christian biblical scholars and critics widely came to the conclusion that 4Q Samuel A from the Dead Sea Scrolls represents an older, more complete, and hence more accurate version of the text. And this passage about the war east of the Jordan was probably later dropped out by scribal error, and hence, in the view of some at least, modern translations like the Revised Standard Version ought to include it. So in this way, this is one example of how the Dead Sea Scrolls did something that ought to seem impossible for both historical and religious reasons, and which would have been unthinkable just 50 years earlier. Specifically, they changed the text of the Bible. Now, as I said, this may seem unthinkable to some, including to devout Jews and Christians, who revere the received text as Holy Writ, or the Word of God. But in fact, ever since the Renaissance and the Reformation, many Christian humanists, like, for example, Erasmus, have undertaken an ongoing quest to correct errors and corruptions in the Bible and to recover the original text. But even still, biblical scholars and historians, as of about 1940, would have considered it unthinkable for the biblical text to change so drastically, with a whole new passage of 75 words being added in. And this is because by that time, scholars had already scoured the world for any known early copies of the books of the Hebrew Bible. And the earliest complete books dated back only to the Middle Ages, about the 10th and 11th centuries, and moreover, these early versions didn't vary all that much, only in small parts. So basically, all early surviving texts of the Hebrew Bible followed three basic outlines, or could be grouped into three basic families. Firstly, there is the Masoretic text, which is in ancient Hebrew, and which was reportedly compiled and edited by Jewish rabbis called the Masoretes in late antiquity, between about the 5th and 9th centuries AD. The oldest surviving complete copy of the Masoretic text is the Leningrad Codex, which is in Russia, and which was written down in about 1008 to 1009 AD. There is also another copy surviving from about 100 years earlier, from the early 900s, called the Aleppo Codex, but it is incomplete and survives only in fragments. Secondly, alongside the Masoretic text, there is the Samaritan text, another Hebrew version, which has been preserved and passed on by the Samaritans, a sort of breakaway independent community of Israelites in Judea, or what's today the West Bank. And the Samaritan text is largely similar to the Masoretic text, but with some passages differing. These are mainly additions, which seek to reconcile conflicting points and ideas in different parts of the Torah, or 5 books of Moses. And also there is a passage in the Samaritan text saying that the holy mountain where God commanded that the temple should be built was Mount Gerizim, not Mount Zion, as most Jews hold it to be. And then thirdly, alongside the Masoretic text and the Samaritan text, there is the Septuagint. This is a version of the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek, which reportedly, according to early chronicles, was translated from Hebrew into Greek by a committee of Greek-speaking Jewish scholars at Alexandria in Egypt in the 1st century BC, supposedly in order to supply a version of the books in Greek for the Library of Alexandria. The Septuagint also is broadly similar to the Masoretic text, but with a number of differences. And just one small example is the passage from 1 Samuel 18, which I cited in my recent video about red, white, and royal blue. That passage describing Jonathan falling in love and forming a covenant with David appears in the Masoretic text, but not in the Septuagint. And we don't know for certain why. Some people say it was mistakenly added into the Masoretic text. I don't think that's true. I think it's most likely that it was excluded from the Septuagint because it was too homoerotic, and the translators were uncomfortable with that. But all of that being said, traditional Jewish worship uses the Masoretic text as the basis of the Holy Scriptures. As for Christians and their translations of what they call the Old Testament, these draw on some combination of the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. Now, it seemed impossible, as I said, by the middle of the 20th century, that any new insights could possibly be made about how the Bible was composed and formed and why there are these different versions. It was unclear when, why, or how Jewish and Christian communities settled on the canonical versions of the Masoretic text, the Samaritan text, and the Septuagint, and it's unclear why these 3 versions differ in various ways. And if there was any earlier so-called original text of each Hebrew biblical book that these different versions derived from, it could only be a matter of speculation and speculative reconstruction. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls changed all of that. They contain among this collection early manuscript versions of all the books of the Hebrew Bible except for Esther. But for whatever reason, all the other books of the Hebrew Bible are found, at least in some small part, among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of them in complete form, others only in fragments. Isaiah seems to have been the most important. It survives among the Dead Sea Scrolls in multiple copies, including 2 large complete scrolls and many fragments, which differ from one another slightly in small points. Other books, including the 5 books of Moses, which compose the Torah, are also found in several versions. So the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in one fell swoop increased the age of the oldest known manuscripts of every book of the Hebrew Bible other than one by over 1,000 years. It shed unprecedented light on the era of variation and flux in the formation and compilation of the Bible before the canon was fixed as we see it today. This fact alone would be enough to make the Dead Sea Scrolls the most important manuscript discovery of the 20th century and among the most impactful and momentous of all time. But there's more. The biblical texts comprise only about 1/4 of the manuscripts found at the caves in Qumran. The other 3/4 comprise various different types of texts: liturgical, theological, prophetic, mystical, and others. that seem to have belonged to a particular party or sect within Jewish society between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD, ending basically at the time of the first Jewish revolt and the destruction of the Second Temple. This happens to be a very significant period of Jewish history and a very mysterious one. So this is the period of time when Judea was ruled first by the independent Hasmonean monarchy in the 2nd to 1st centuries BC, and then by the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. And this specific period has traditionally been called, at least by Christian and Gentile scholars, has been called the intertestamental period, because it falls between the time when the last books of the Old Testament were composed and when the first books of the New Testament were composed. So from at least the Christian point of view, they form a sort of black hole with much less information about what was going on or what Jews and Christians believed or practiced. Today, this period is more often called the late Second Temple period, to be more sort of neutral between the Jewish and Christian perspectives. And arguably, in some ways, this is the most mysterious time in Jewish history, with the fewest surviving original documents. And it's described and recorded only in a small handful of histories and chronicles, such as Josephus's books, Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish Revolt, which were written a few years after the end of this period. And it's described in these texts as a time of ferment and fragmentation, with power struggles among different parties and camps, contending over how to properly practice Judaism and over how to respond to the Roman incursion. And in some ways, one could see this period as the most significant for world history, since this was a time of tumult and contention that was apparently the seedbed from which two religions arose. One, Rabbinic Judaism, which evolved out of the Pharisaic school in the late Second Temple period, but which only took shape and compiled authoritative books like the Mishnah and the Talmud after the destruction of the Second Temple. And secondly, Christianity, which began as a messianic school, possibly one among many, that promised a deliverance of Israel and the Israelites from Roman rule. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are doubly revolutionary, both as the source of our earliest biblical texts and in that they open a massive window onto the ideas, hopes, and disputes running through Judaism in the late Second Temple period, which was the time of Christ's life and ministry. And in this way, they are our best hope at clarifying what was new and what was borrowed, both in Rabbinic Judaism and in Christianity, as they emerged in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. But at the same time, the scrolls themselves are also highly mysterious. There is still no certainty as to exactly who the authors of the scrolls were, how they lived, how they produced or collected the scrolls, or why they stashed them away in the caves around Qumran. Their relationship to modern Judaism, and especially to Christianity, is hotly disputed, and almost everything about the scrolls, as you'll find when you read about them, everything about them is mysterious and ambiguous, and they strangely seem to resist and baffle any clear explanation as to where they came from or what they mean. And they've been the subject of endless academic and intellectual battles, some of them exceptionally acrimonious and charged with political and religious enmities. And they've even been the subject of actual legal battles, with one landmark copyright suit being fought over the right to publish the scroll texts. So this is an extremely complex subject. Dozens of books have been published just within the academic press, aside from the massive output of popular media. And the scrolls have really given rise to an entire new subdiscipline unto themselves, combining archaeology, linguistics, paleography, and biblical exegesis. But with all of that in mind, I cannot get into all of the rich, complicated details of this corpus, how it was discovered, and how it's been debated and fought over. But I will try to briefly discuss 5 points: the discovery of the scrolls, the dispute over control of the scrolls, their contents, the arguments over the scrolls' origins, and the best interpretations of their meaning and significance. So to begin with the discovery of the scrolls, in order to understand how this discovery was made, we have to understand where they fit into the geography and topography of what we can broadly call the Holy Land, right? The country that has also been known as Palestine or Israel or Judea, whatever you want to call it. If one approaches this country at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean Sea from the seacoast, one finds first a long, flat coastal plain with a basically Mediterranean climate, allowing for farming of grain and olives and other crops. Then as one moves inland from the sea, the land rises up to a high mountainous ridge running north to south. And most of the famous mountains that we hear of in the Bible, like Mount Tabor, Mount Gerizim, and Mount Zion, are in this elevated ridge. Also, most of the ancient cities of the country are on hilltops or plateaus along this high ridge, such as Jenin and Nablus in the north, Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Bethlehem around the middle, and Hebron near the highest point of the ridge to the south. Then, if one continues to the east, past this high mountainous ridge, the land then slopes very precipitously downward from west to east, until it reaches a dramatic fall line with steep cliffs dropping down into a deep, flat rift valley with low, flat desert lands at the bottom, which are below sea level. In this rift valley, there is very little rainfall, but what moisture there is tends to drain into the Sea of Galilee, a lake in the northern end of the valley, and then the Jordan River, which flows southward and ultimately into the Dead Sea, which is a long, narrow inland sea, the shores of which are the lowest place on earth and which are encrusted with salt. The Dead Sea's waters are supersaturated with salt so that no plants or animals can live in it. And specifically, if one proceeds directly eastward from Jerusalem, about 15 miles east of the city, one finds the steepest and most dramatic cliffs, dropping off from the high ridge of land down into the Rift Valley. And these cliffs are cut into by several narrow valleys or clefts, running from west to east. And most of these clefts or narrow gaps in the cliffside are called wadis, which is an Arabic word for a narrow valley or gorge with a dry stream bed that only flows with water intermittently after rainfall. The largest of these wadis in this area east of Jerusalem is called Wadi Qumran, and it runs from the high plateau near Jerusalem downward and eastward, cutting through the line of cliffs, and then down to a wide stream bed that runs across the desert plains, ultimately flowing into the northwestern corner of the Dead Sea. Also, at the foot of these high cliffs, immediately north of Wadi Qumran, there is a small rock plateau or platform extending out eastward and ending in a series of smaller cliffs, spurs, and escarpments. Near the eastern edge of this platform, basically perched overlooking the mile or so of desert plains leading down to the Dead Sea, there is a cluster of ancient building foundations, pits, and ruined walls, which seem to be the remains of an ancient building complex, which has been called in Arabic Khirbet Qumran, simply meaning the ruins of Qumran. In the 1800s and early 1900s, when Palestine was under Ottoman rule, some European antiquarians and archaeologists occasionally visited and examined Khirbet Qumran, hoping that it might represent the remains of a site mentioned in the Bible. That was their main interest. For example, some suspected it might be the remains of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were destroyed in the book of Genesis, and where Lot's wife reportedly was turned into a pillar of salt. So some suspected that this reference to a pillar of salt might have to do with the salt formations around the shores of the Dead Sea. But these antiquarians and archaeologists found the site to be simply too small to represent even a town, let alone a city. And they figured that it might perhaps be the remains of a Roman fort or outpost. So in the period of the so-called British Mandate, when Palestine was under British control in the 1920s and 30s, Khirbet Qumran and the area around it were generally left neglected. And the only people who occasionally visited this deserted area were Bedouin shepherds. So the Bedouins are semi-nomadic shepherding peoples organized into small tribes and villages who generally lived in the southern and eastern desert regions of the Holy Land, especially the Negev desert. And some Bedouins did occasionally come up to the area of Qumran in order to graze their animals on the scrubby plants on cliffs and hillsides around the wadis during the day. And then customarily they would move south in the evening to a site about 2 miles farther down the coast of the Dead Sea called Ein Feshcha, where there are springs and small streams where one could water one's animals. So one day, we don't know the exact date, sometime in the winter of 1946 to 47, 3 Bedouin shepherds were grazing their animals on a stretch of the high hills and cliffs about 1 mile north of Wadi Qumran. These 3 men were all cousins and members of the tribe Ta'amireh. The eldest of them was named Khalil Musa, the middle cousin was Juma Muhammad, and the youngest was a teenager named Muhammad Ahmed El-Hamed, although he was nicknamed Ed-Dib, meaning the wolf, perhaps in reference to his adventurous and tenacious spirit. On this particular day, it was getting to be late afternoon, and the shepherds decided that they had to withdraw and move south to the springs of Ein Feshcha. Juma, the middle cousin, climbed up the cliff sides in order to regather his animals that had wandered far off. While there, he came upon a small, round opening in the stone cliff face. Possibly out of curiosity, or possibly because he was concerned that a sheep had wandered in, he picked up a stone and he tossed it into the opening. And a moment later, he heard a sound that sounded like shattering pottery. So he was intrigued and wondered if perhaps he had located hidden treasure in this cave, which was known to turn up in remote spots in the desert from time to time. Perhaps there was something valuable to be recovered. So he shouted down to his cousins on the ground down below, who were skeptical and did not follow him. So he scrambled back down the cliff with his animals, and by this point the sun was setting and it was too late to investigate. So the 3 cousins decided that they would withdraw to Ein Feshcha, and the next day they would come back to Qumran and perhaps investigate what Juma had found. But that next day they came to Qumran too late again, and once again there was no time to go climbing up these cliffs searching for a tiny cave entrance, especially as it was getting dark. So instead they bedded down and encamped there at Qumran that second night. And early on the morning of the 3rd day, just as the sun was coming up, the young cousin Ed-Dib woke up very early, and while his cousins are still sleeping, he goes up and finds this cave again. Because he is small, he is able to shimmy in through the narrow opening. And he finds in the dim light that's coming in from the east, he finds that there is debris scattered on the floor of the cave, and he sees a series of tall terracotta jars with lids leaning against the walls of the cave. He begins opening the jars, and time again he is disappointed and increasingly desperate as he finds one jar after another completely empty. The 9th jar that he opened was full of dirt. Finally, in the 10th jar, he finds something. It's a cloth sack, and inside it is an old scroll rolled up with a leather strap enclosing it. Soon after, he finds 2 more jars with similar scrolls wrapped in cloth shrouds. So he rushes down the cliffs with these first 3 scrolls in his arms. These 3 scrolls which we today know to be the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Commentary on Habakkuk, and the Rule of the Community. Ed-Dib shows these finds to his cousins, but again these 2 men are unimpressed. They suspect Ed-Dib of hiding something, perhaps gold and silver treasure that he had found, which he is not sharing with them. But nonetheless, they proceed again to Infishra with this loot that Edib found in the cave. In the coming days, the three shepherds then return to the main Ta'amira village encampment, which is south of Bethlehem, and they show their discovery to fellow tribesmen who are naturally intrigued. And over the next several weeks, Juma, the middle cousin, takes some of his friends and associates from the tribe back north to the cave at Qumran. And after a more systematic search, they find 4 more intact scrolls. In early April 1947, Juma and Khalil travel to Bethlehem, and they bring 3 scrolls that they had found to the marketplace. At first, they are turned away by an antiquities dealer who suspects that the items are either stolen or forged. But as they are about to give up, they run into a cloth dealer whom they know, named George Ishaya Shamoun, who customarily supplies cloaks to the Bedouin tribesmen. And George takes them to the shop of a cobbler named Khalil Iskander Shaheen, also called Kondo for short. And George and Kondo make a deal with these shepherds. They pay a small deposit for the scrolls, which they then keep in Kondo's shop, and they will then endeavor to sell them on the antiquities market on behalf of the Bedouin tribesmen in return for a 1/3 share of the sale price. Now it happens that George Shamoun and Kondo Shaheen are both Syrian Orthodox Christians, and Kondo is familiar with the Syrian Orthodox Metropolitan or Archbishop of Jerusalem, who is named Athanasius Yeshua Samuel, and who lives in the Syrian Orthodox Monastery of St. Mark's in Jerusalem. Kondo happens to visit Jerusalem, including St. Mark's, during Holy Week, and there he tells the Archbishop that he has a set of very old scrolls, written in, as he thought, Syriac, which had been found in the deserts near the Dead Sea, wrapped up, quote, like mummies. So at this point, the Archbishop Samuel is very intrigued, and he knows that if they are genuine, these scrolls must be very ancient, and he asks Kondo to bring them to St. Mark's Monastery. A few days later, Kondo brings up to him the scroll which we now know as the Rule of the Community. Samuel recognizes that they are on very old animal skin parchment, which he proves by breaking off a small piece from the edge and burning it. And he also recognizes that the scroll is not written in Syriac, but in Hebrew. And he asks Kondo to have his Bedouin associates bring all of the scrolls that they have to him there in Jerusalem. And they agree to do this, but it takes months. The first time, some shepherds do set out, along with George Shamoun, the cloth merchant, to bring several scrolls to St. Mark's. But another monk who is guarding the gate of the monastery mistakenly turns them away. It seems that he was prejudiced against Bedouins, and he thinks that they are simply trying to peddle some old Torahs that are in poor condition. The Archbishop Samuel, of course, is mortified when he finds out that this has happened. He calls Kondo, apologizes profusely, and implores them to come back again. But now there is an even longer delay. Why is this? It's because of the deteriorating political situation in what was known as the Mandate of Palestine. So the British government, unable to resolve the disputes over control of the land politically, is now making preparations to simply withdraw and allow the Jews, Arabs, and others to fight it out. So Jewish militants increasingly are bombing and raiding British government positions to try to hasten their withdrawal from the country. The roads are increasingly dangerous, and the British have started setting up barricades and barbed wire fences to separate the religious and ethnic neighborhoods in hopes of simply delaying the civil war until after they have left. So at this moment, travel through the country, especially around Jerusalem, is difficult and risky. Nonetheless, in July 1947, George and some Bedouins finally come with 4 scrolls in tow. Samuel is astonished and buys them on the spot for 24 British pounds. The Bedouins describe the cave where they reportedly found the scrolls, and the Archbishop, in hopes of authenticating this find, which he now owns, sends another monk from the monastery who treks eastward through very dangerous territory and terrain, finds the cave, and verifies that it contains scraps of parchment and ceramic vessels. Over the next 9 months, Samuel tries to find scholarly experts to validate and identify the scrolls. First, he tries the Palestine Department of Antiquities, but they assume that these scrolls are fake and refuse even to look at them. Secondly, he contacts the École biblique et archéologique, which is sometimes simply called the French School, and which is located in the French Dominican Friary north of Jerusalem. 2 scholars from the French school go and look at the scrolls. They identify the texts as Hebrew, and one of them specifically as the book of Isaiah. But they think that they are probably not very ancient. They ask to see some pieces of pottery to verify this find, but the archbishop doesn't have any in his possession, and so these French scholars lose interest and turn away. Thirdly, the archbishop manages to get some scholars to come from the Hebrew University, and they are indeed very interested and ask to come back again to take photographs of the scrolls. But they never return, perhaps because of the deteriorating political situation and the danger, especially for Jews, of venturing into the old city. So at this point, Samuel is getting very frustrated, and he starts learning Hebrew in hopes of reading and interpreting the scrolls himself. In the meantime, over the later months of 1947, Bedouin tribesmen found more manuscripts in the cave, and unbeknownst to the archbishop, these tribesmen have brought some of these additional scrolls that they've discovered to an Armenian antiquities dealer in Jerusalem named Faidi Salahi. On November 23, 1947, Faidi Salahi contacts an archaeologist at Hebrew University named E.L. Sukenik, and Salahi tells him that he has something that Sukenik must see. The two of them then meet in Jerusalem and talk over the top of a barbed wire fence separating the sections of the city. Salahi shows Sukenik a scrap of leather with Hebrew characters which look just like those found on ancient funeral inscriptions on ceramics. 4 days later, Sukenik manages to get a special government pass, enabling him to go and visit Salahi directly at his shop and to see more of the small scroll fragments. Salahi tells him that shopkeepers in Bethlehem have more material, including 3 more complete scrolls. Sukenik, of course, wants to go and see them, but at this point the UN is scheduled imminently to vote on the proposal to partition Palestine, and hence at any moment all hell might break loose while he is in the middle of traveling. But it happens that the UN delays this vote for several days. And accounts of exactly what happened next vary, but one way or another, the 3 scrolls in Bethlehem get back to Jerusalem, and Sukenik purchases them. And we now know these 3 scrolls as the War Scroll, another Isaiah scroll, apart from the first one, and the so-called Hymns of Thanksgiving. So Sukenik acquires them and brings them in turn to Hebrew University. And the very next day, after those scrolls are delivered to the library at Hebrew University, the UN votes to partition Palestine. Now, soon after, in the coming days, E.L. Sukenik learns from the university librarian that sometime earlier, Syrian Orthodox monks had offered to sell to the university some old manuscripts, which the librarian figured were in Samaritan, in his words. Sukenik immediately surmises that these are from the same ancient collection as the 3 scrolls that he has just acquired for Hebrew University, and he wants to go see them at St. Mark's Monastery right away, but going into the old city was very dangerous. So instead, he remains at Hebrew University and starts raising money in order to make an offer to buy the scrolls from the archbishop. In January 1948, an Orthodox Christian man in Jerusalem who knows Sukenik personally from archaeological work offers to serve as a go-between. And he enables Sukenik to see in person the Isaiah scroll at the YMCA because this is in neutral territory. Samuel considers Sukenik's offer of money to buy the scrolls from St. Mark's. But another monk in the monastery named Butrus Salmi, who's been away traveling but has just returned to Jerusalem, Salmi advises that the archbishop should wait. They don't know yet exactly what the scrolls are or how valuable they might be, and they decide to wait until the political situation has calmed down and they can get advice from overseas. The following month, in February 1948, Brother Salmi calls the American School for Oriental Research, which is also north of the Old City, close to the French school. And Salmi speaks with a young American scholar there named John Cheever. And with Cheever, Salmi arranges to bring one of the scrolls to the American school the next day. And when it gets there, Cheever is amazed. He sees right away that the script is much older than any known biblical text. He copies out a portion of the scroll, which he later determines is from the book of Isaiah. And he is so astonished that he risks his life by venturing into the old city in the coming days in order to meet directly with the archbishop at St. Mark's. He insists to the archbishop that the monks must bring all of their scrolls to the American school to be photographed, which Cheever then does himself, very precisely and painstakingly over the following weeks. And he happens to be the first of several scholars over about the next 20 years to produce good photo negatives of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The American scholars then have the scrolls safely wrapped up and stowed away back at St. Mark's. And Cheever sends a photograph of a portion of the text to America, namely to the scholar W.F. Albright at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And Albright is known as the world's leading expert on ancient writings and the doyen of Palestine archaeology. On March 15th, Cheever receives a reply from Albright in the form of a letter which says in part, quote, "My heartiest congratulations on the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. There is no doubt in my mind that the script is more archaic than that of the Nash Papyrus. I should prefer a date around 100 BC. What an absolutely incredible find, and there can happily not be the slightest doubt in the world about the genuineness of the manuscript." End quote. By the beginning of April, however, war is sweeping all through what was Palestine. The American school is abandoned and closed down. St. Mark's Monastery, too, is now unsafe. Brother Boutros Salmi is killed by a bomb fragment while standing in the monastery courtyard. The Archbishop Samuel sends the scrolls in his possession to Lebanon, where they are stored for a time in a bank vault in Beirut. He then takes them personally in his own possession to America, where they then tour around and are displayed by several museums. But there is a cloud hanging over these manuscripts. There are disputes and conflicting claims about who properly owns them: the Bedouins, the various middlemen who trafficked them, the archbishop, the monastery, the church, the American school, the new state of Israel, or the kingdom of Jordan, which by now is occupying the area of Qumran. Hence, academic institutions like Yale and Duke decline to buy the manuscripts. And the Archbishop Samuel does not know what to do with them. So in the spring of 1954, he placed a for sale ad in the Wall Street Journal, which ran on June 1st, 1954, and read, quote, "Miscellaneous for sale, the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. Box F206, Wall Street Journal." 1 month later, the Archbishop Samuel successfully sold the scrolls to an American banker named Sidney Estridge for $100,000 and handed them off to him in person at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Now, Samuel did not know that Estridge was acting at this point as a purchasing agent on behalf of the State of Israel. So, figuring that the Archbishop would be reluctant to sell to the new state, which was so controversial and the subject of conflict and strife in the Middle East, E.L. Sukenik's son, named Yigael Yadin, had arranged for Estridge to make the purchase on behalf of the new state. By February 1955, the 4 scrolls were all in Israel, together with the 3 located at Hebrew University. And 10 years after that, in 1965, the State of Israel built a museum called the Shrine of the Book in a mid-century modern style in order to house the 7 scrolls that were in their possession. The centerpiece of the museum is a rotunda with the complete Great Isaiah scroll unrolled to full length and wrapped around a central kiosk in the middle of the rotunda. Now, that might sound like the end of the story, but that is, in a sense, only the beginning. In the 1948 war, the Kingdom of Jordan seized and occupied the West Bank, which is a large zone along the western side of the Dead Sea and Jordan River, and which includes the area of Qumran. In January 1949, the Jordanian government sent the Arab Legion to search for the cave where the scrolls had been discovered. And in the following months, the Jordanian Antiquities Department sponsors excavations of the cave. To oversee them, they tap a scholar named Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican friar based at the École Biblique et Archaeologique, or French school, north of Jerusalem. This team finds more fragments of scrolls, cloth, and pottery. In 1951, Roland de Vaux and his team, under Jordanian auspices, begin an investigation of the ruins at Khirbet Qumran. They find the remains of a large central building with a courtyard and several large rooms, and smaller outbuildings around it, as well as complex waterworks, including channels, cisterns, and several stepped pools that resemble what are known in Judaism as mikvahs, or ritual baths. At the same time, Bedouin shepherds begin searching among the hills and cliffs north of Qumran for more caves or treasure. By February 1952, they find another one, now called Cave 2, nearby Cave 1, which has hundreds of fragments from at least 33 manuscripts. And these include previously unknown Hebrew versions of the books of Sirach and Jubilees. In March 1952, archaeologists with DeVaux's team find another cave called Number 3, farther north, and this one contains a single complete scroll inscribed on a rolled copper sheet, what we now simply call the Copper Scroll. In the fall of 1952, archaeologists who are excavating the Qumran ruins also begin to search among the smaller slopes and cliffs immediately surrounding the site of the ruins. In September, they discover Cave 4, which is the so-called Mother Lode, a massive cache of 15,000 fragments from about 500 different texts, as well as a collection of Jewish ritual objects, including tefillin or prayer phylacteries and mezuzahs. Over the following months of 1952, they also find 6 more caves, numbered from 5 through 10, all of them relatively small, some of them possibly man-made, around the edges of the stone platform around Khirbet Qumran. These are gradually excavated over the course of the mid-1950s, and each cave yields manuscript fragments ranging in number from 1 to about 30 in each cave, along with objects like lamps, jars, and more mezuzahs. Finally, in 1956, Bedouin shepherds discover Cave 11, which is farther back up to the north between Caves 1 and 3. And this one has several dozen manuscripts, some of them fairly complete. And among them is the pièce de résistance, the so-called Temple Scroll, which is the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls at almost 27 feet in length. The Temple Scroll is acquired by Kondo in Bethlehem, who had it in his possession until 1967, when Israel gained control of the West Bank and an Israeli military officer found Kondo and confiscated the scroll, later compensating him to the tune of about $100,000. So with the Temple Scroll, this basically completes the catalog of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls that have come publicly to light as of this day. Now, one might reasonably wonder whether there are more. One major editor of the scrolls, John Struggnell, who we'll talk about more later, claimed in the 1980s that several more scrolls had come out of Cave 11, that last one to be found, and were being held secretly in private hands in Jordan. And he claimed that he had seen 2 of them himself, and that another scholar who had worked on the excavations at Qumran claimed to, on his deathbed, to have seen 2 more. Now, putting that aside, one might further observe that 11 is a rather awkward number, especially for a series of sites associated with Jewish sacred texts and objects. The number 12 might make more sense, thinking of the 12 tribes of Israel or the 12 signs of the zodiac, etc. Well, in 2017, archaeologists from Hebrew University did find another cave, with debris including scraps of ancient cloth and leather straps for binding scrolls, as well as one piece of blank parchment. And they surmised that this cave had also held Dead Sea Scrolls and had been raided decades ago, perhaps in the 1950s, and that more texts out of this cave might be somewhere out there on the black market, or maybe hidden away again somewhere far away. So finally, one can ask, are there really only these 12 caves? Is that the complete number? Are there maybe more sites still out there, still undiscovered? But regardless of all that, as of today, the known, studied, and published Dead Sea Scrolls comprise tens of thousands of fragments coming from an estimated total of 981 different scrolls. So now, what became of all of these scrolls and fragments once they were uncovered? Who did they belong to, and what did people learn from them? Well, to begin with the easy part, which is to say the 7 largely complete scrolls that were taken from Cave 1, and that all landed up in Israeli hands. They were transcribed and published fairly early on. In 1950, the American School publishes facsimiles of the Isaiah scroll and the Habakkuk commentary. And the following year, in 1951, they also published the Rule of the Community. In 1953, E.L. Sukenik, just before his death, prepares plates and transcriptions of the other Cave 1 scrolls. But the massive finds from the other caves, especially Cave 4, those are a whole other story. So the archaeologists working with the Jordanian state suddenly find themselves in possession of thousands of text fragments that they have no idea what to do with. So in 1953-4, Jordan organizes an editorial team to process, transcribe, and publish the scroll texts. And this team comprises mainly Catholic scholars, with a core group of mostly French Catholic priests, formerly headed by Roland Deveau, who is also undertaking the excavations at Khirbet Qumran. And the Jordanian government also taps a handful of others, including the young American Catholic scholar Frank Moore Cross, who is a student of W.F. Albright, whose letter I quoted before, and also 2 British scholars from Protestant backgrounds, namely John Marco Allegro and the 24-year-old linguistics prodigy John Struggnell. The team includes no Jews, even though some leading experts on ancient Hebrew texts are Jewish, and Jordan, it seems, is ill-disposed towards Jewish scholars, especially in the aftermath of the Arab-Israeli War. So the team assembles the scrolls and fragments in the Palestine Archaeological Museum, and the young American scholar Frank Moore Cross described the situation in this way, quote, "Many fragments are so brittle or friable that they can scarcely even be touched with a camel's hair brush. Most are warped, crinkled, or shrunken, crusted with soil chemicals, blackened by moisture and age. The problems of cleaning, flattening, identifying, and piecing them together are formidable." End quote. So faced with this daunting task, the scholars lay the scroll fragments out in a large archival room in the museum, which they come to call the scrollery. They place the fragments under glass plates and painstakingly try to arrange them into related groupings and to reconstruct the lost texts. The conditions of the scrollery are in many ways far below present-day standards for conserving ancient documents. Sunlight comes in through the windows, the small glass cases trap moisture, allowing condensation, and the scholars often handle the fragments with bare hands even while smoking. And over the course of the years, the conditions of many of the scroll fragments deteriorate. Hence, there is mounting anxiety among other scholars in the outside world that the team ought to get their work published soon, before the texts are lost to time and degradation. After having grouped together many fragments, the editorial team then divides the texts up among themselves, and each member is assigned a set of texts to transcribe, translate, and interpret. Roland de Vaux will then oversee the publication of the texts and analyses in a series of volumes titled Discoveries in the Judean Desert. In 1955, the first volume is published, and it comprises largely intact materials from Cave 1. In the later 1950s, the scholars produce a concordance, meaning a sort of special dictionary, collecting all of the places in the corpus where each word occurs, along with a bit of context. And they produce copies of this concordance to aid with their own translation and analysis, but they use it only internally, and its very existence is kept secret from outside scholars. Over the course of the 1960s, 4 more volumes of the scrolls are published in the series, and the 4th one is the first one to deal with the massive materials found in Cave 4. So they are, you could say, making progress in digging into the mother lode. But still, by this point, it has been well over a decade since most of the scrolls were found, and a lot of the international scholarly community is anxious and frustrated that the vast majority of the corpus still has not been published, and for the most part, it is not even shared in any way with those outside the team. The group follows the sort of informal, unofficial protocols of academia, which hold that once texts have been assigned to a scholar, it is up to them to publish, one might say, with all deliberate speed. But in the meantime, it is entirely up to that scholar what to share or not with anybody that they choose. And if they cannot complete the task, then they can assign it to someone else of their own choosing, most often one of their own graduate students. And this is what starts to happen beginning in the 1960s and 70s, where talented scholars, especially Anglophone ones like Cross and Struggnell, are offered positions at prestigious universities in the United States. And rather than simply give up their claim on their portion of the scrolls, instead they pass them on, sort of like personal fiefdoms, to their students. Meanwhile, the team is clearly too small to handle the massive task of sorting, reassembling, transcribing, and translating the corpus, and they refuse to grow larger or to share the burden. What is more, by the end of the 60s, they take on the further task of appending detailed historical analyses with their publications. Evidently, the team is worried that the scrolls might be exploited for strange or conspiratorial ideas, and they want to maintain not only physical control over the texts themselves, but also ideological control over how they are received and interpreted. But this leads then to even longer delays. 2 developments do happen, which some hope might lead to a change in this situation and break the logjam, either a hastening of the pace of publication or an opening up of broader access. So for one thing, in 1967, following the Six-Day War, Israel gains control of the West Bank and Jerusalem. And as part of the spoils of war, they get control over the scrolls and the museum. And all of these are placed under the purview of the Israel Antiquities Authority. And this seems as if it might shake things up. But at first, the Israeli government pledges to respect the status quo and not to interfere in the editorial team's operations. Secondly, in 1971, Roland de Vaux dies, and leadership of the team is passed to another French-Dominican scholar named Pierre Benoit. And under this new editor-in-chief, the pace actually slows down even more. Only 2 volumes of the scrolls are published under his leadership in 1977 and 1982. So by this point, outside frustration is reaching a boiling point. Outside scholars are condemning the slow pace and the insularity of the team. In 1977, the eminent British scholar Geza Vermes says, quote, "Unless drastic measures are taken at once, the greatest and most valuable of all Hebrew and Aramaic manuscript discoveries is likely to become the academic scandal par excellence of the 20th century." End quote. And also among the broader public, curiosity is only rising, and conspiracy theories begin to surface, alleging that the Catholic Church is deliberately suppressing the contents of the scrolls, presumably because they reveal something embarrassing or discrediting to Christianity. And a sort of proto-Dan Brown-style thriller mystery is published based on this premise. And this mounting fear and distrust is only intensified when the British scholar John Marco Allegro resigns from the team and alleges insularity and discrimination against non-Catholics. The Israeli government, through the Antiquities Authority, does begin to intervene, insisting on small reforms, including adding in Jewish scholars into the editorial team. But this is about it, and it doesn't appreciably change the pace of publication. So in effect, one could say that the Israeli government did not break up the monopoly of control over the scrolls, but rather joined it. And anger and criticism continue, including among the scholarly community, especially after it is revealed that the team has still published less than half of the whole corpus. A lot of the discontent is channeled into a journal called the Biblical Archaeology Review, which is published in the U.S. by the Jewish-American scholar Herschel Shanks, who advocates for the release of the scrolls to the wider scholarly community. Another possible window for change seems to open up in 1984, when Father Benoit dies, and the following year, in 1985, the position of editor-in-chief is assigned to the British scholar John Struggnell, who had decades earlier joined as the youngest member of the team. But new researchers who go to Jerusalem in the mid and later 80s to ask for broad access to the scrolls are peremptorily dismissed. And reportedly at an academic conference, another scholar confronted John Struggnell about the slow pace, and Struggnell replied, quote, "We seem to have acquired a bunch of fleas who are in the business of annoying us," end quote. In response, the cover of the next issue of the Biblical Archaeology Review has a picture of John Struggnell covered in fleas. Suspicions rise that anti-Semitism or political opposition to the State of Israel might be playing a role in the delays and the refusals of access. The Israeli government places a new supervisor named Emmanuel Tov on the team to work as a co-director alongside Struggnell, which Struggnell clearly resents. A concession is finally made in 1988, when the team prints 30 copies of their concordance and shares it with some academic libraries in various countries. In this way, at least they begin sharing the philological knowledge that has been gleaned from the scrolls. But the conflict comes to a head in 1990 when a reporter named Avi Katzman with the Israeli left-leaning newspaper Haaretz asks to interview John Struggnell. And Struggnell agrees on the condition that the interview be published in English in an Anglophone outlet, as well as in Hebrew in Haaretz. Who knows? I don't know why he made this stipulation. Perhaps he figured an English-speaking audience would be more sympathetic to him or his views. But regardless, the interview was held on October 28, 1990. And I will give you just a sample of what John Struggnell said up front. So when asked whether he opposed the state of Israel, Struggnell insists in response that he is not anti-Semitic, but, in his words, Judaism is originally racist. It's a folk religion. It's not a higher religion. An anti-Judaist. That's what I am. There, I plead guilty. I plead guilty in the way the church has pleaded guilty all along, because we're not guilty. We're right. Christianity presents itself as a religion which replaces the Jewish religion. The correct answer of Jews to Christianity is to become Christian. I agree that there have been monstrosities in the past, the Inquisition, things like that. We should certainly behave ourselves like Christian gentlemen, but the basic judgment on the Jewish religion is, for me, a negative one. So at this point, naturally, the journalist asked Struggnell whether his views about the Jewish religion might affect his work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he answered, quote, "Unless someone talks to me about the subject, I don't. When I'm working on a Qumran text, think about how stupid and wrong the Jews were. I'm concerned with trying to find out what a document is saying in its context." End quote. And thirdly, the interviewer, probably rubbing his hands together, asks Struggnell what bothers him about the Jewish religion specifically. And Struggnell replied, quote, "The fact that it has survived when it should have disappeared. Christianity now uses much more ironic language for all this. These are brutal terms. I'm putting it in harsh terms. For me, the answer is mass conversion." End quote. So whatever one might think about John Strugnell's personal theological convictions, one does have to acknowledge that this interview is one of the great all-time examples of a scholar shooting himself in the foot. So what happened subsequently? Well, Struggnell is removed from the position of editor-in-chief and is replaced by Manuel Tov, but he is kept on the editorial team and is still responsible for the texts assigned to him. He is also shortly after removed from his professorship at Harvard, much to the upset of his friends and admirers, some of whom apparently are still bitter about it. Now, this changeover of leadership in the editorial team perhaps emboldens those who want to bring the scrolls out into the open. And the following year, in 1991, a professor at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati named Ben-Zion Wacholder has in his hands the concordance from the Dead Sea Scrolls team, which lists where each word appears in the corpus, along with a few words before and after. And he gives this concordance to a grad student named Martin Abegg, who then enters all of the information into a computer database, and a program sorts out the words and phrases, and from them reconstructs 16 complete texts. Abegg and Wacholder then, shortly after, publish these reconstituted scrolls. This leads to a public controversy. The editorial team in Jerusalem condemns what they call the theft of what they claim as their own work. And John Struggnell is quoted as saying, "What else can one call it but stealing?" But Wacholder, for his part, argues that the scrolls belong to all of humankind, and that the editorial team can't possibly hold some sort of property claim on the scrolls themselves, which are 2,000 years old. And when this fight gets picked up in the popular press, most writers and commentators tend to agree with Wacholder's view and favor openness. But this was only the beginning. It spurs on more reporting and commentary about the fight over control of the scrolls. And so several different dominoes begin falling all at once in the later months of 1991. And the texts end up becoming publicly available through 4 different channels. And particularly importantly, the photographic negatives come into play. So remember, starting with Triever all the way back in the 40s, several scholars and technicians have taken good quality photos of the texts, and most of them being Arab scholars and archivists working at the Palestine Archaeology Museum. Also, in the early 1980s, an American philanthropist named Elizabeth Hay Bechtel endowed a new ancient biblical manuscript center in California. And as part of this project, she also sends a photographer to Jerusalem to make copies of the Palestine Archaeology Museum's set of photographic negatives of the scrolls. And the idea is that they will then form an emergency backup set in America in case anything happens to the first set. After they are brought back to the US, Bechtel also has another duplicate set made, and she gives one set to the new ABMC while she keeps the other in her own private collection. She then later breaks with the ABMC, they have a falling out, and so ultimately she bequeaths her set of negatives in her possession not to the ABMC, but rather to the Huntington Library in Pasadena, which is one of the premier research archives in the US. So in 1990, a new director took charge of the Huntington, and after learning about the struggle to access the scrolls and learning that the Huntington actually has a set of these photo negatives in its collection, he announces that the Huntington set of negatives will now be open to be viewed by all researchers. Now, the Israel Antiquities Authority and the editorial team in Israel are outraged. They accuse the Huntington of breach of agreement, theft, copyright infringement, etc., and they threaten to sue. But the Huntington does not back down. So the IAA then tries to persuade the Huntington to impose certain restrictions on access, but again the Huntington ignores them. And at this point the IAA is flummoxed and shocked that most public and scholarly opinion seems to be on the Huntington Library's side. Meanwhile, as all of this is going on at the same time, starting in 1989, somebody starts sending photographic plates of the scrolls in packages in the mail to Robert Eisemman, a historian at Cal State Long Beach, who had been quoted in the press in support of opening access to the scrolls. Now, Eisemman has never said who sent this photo set to him, if he even knows himself, but he has said that it was not the Huntington Library, it was somebody else. And he and a colleague named Robinson prepare this set for publication. So in November 1991, just 2 months after the Huntington Library had opened access to their collection, the Biblical Archaeological Society under Herschel Shanks publishes a complete book of facsimiles of all the unpublished scrolls, which had been prepared by Robinson and Eisemman. Then in the following year, in 1992, Eisemman and another scholar named Michael Wise publish a book with transcriptions and English translations of 50 of the scroll texts. And the title of this book is The Dead Sea Scrolls Uncovered, the first complete translation and interpretation of 50 key documents withheld for over 35 years. Now at this point, scholarly opinion is mostly in favor of disclosure, as we've seen. But this book did cause something of a backlash, and some other scholars argue that Eisemman and Wise have gone too far, using other scholars' editorial work which they had gleaned from small leaks like conference handouts. And ultimately, Eisemman issues an apology for not giving sufficient credit to others and for overinflating claims that all of the texts in the book had never before been seen or published. But regardless, after that, a steady stream of books translating, analyzing, and commenting on the scrolls appears in both the academic and popular presses. Now, a final incident in 1993, an Israeli scholar, Elisha Qimron, files a lawsuit because the facsimile edition of the scrolls had used his work in assembling and transcribing one of the scrolls, which happens to be the only letter found in the Qumran caves, and the book had not given him credit or asked him permission. So he sues Shanks, who published the volume, and the two editors, Eisemman and Robinson. Their defense was that the work itself, which is the scroll found in the cave, was not Qimron's original work. Now, this argument might have flown in American court, but Qimron sued in Israeli court on the basis that copies of the book had been mailed to Israel, although it was published in the US. And the Israeli court found in Qimron's favor and ordered Shanks to pay $50,000 of compensation, which was an unprecedentedly high amount for a single copyright infringement of a work that didn't have very wide commercial value. Now, whatever merit Qimron's case did or did not have, we may speculate that politics probably played some role, specifically resentment on the part of Israel that this priceless cultural property and what they considered to be a patrimony of the state of Israel had been, in a sense, usurped by foreigners. So in the years since then, over the last 30 years, the battle over access to the Dead Sea Scrolls has died down, and the Israel Antiquities Authority and the editorial team simply lost control of these materials. But still, the haze of political and religious controversy still hangs over the scrolls and arguably influences how they are interpreted. But in order to understand the meanings and the knowledge that have been gleaned from the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's first just look at the content. What does this corpus actually contain? So, as I mentioned before, the entire Qumran corpus comprises the remains of about 981 scrolls, most of them surviving only in small fragments, but a few dozen nearly complete and intact. As for the materials in which they are written, about 90% are on vellum, which is a good quality parchment made from animal hides. About 10% are on papyrus, and a small handful, including the intact so-called copper scroll, are on thin copper sheets. And using DNA testing, archaeologists have also found that as for the scrolls written on parchment, the more sacred ones, such as biblical texts, are written on the hides of domesticated animals like cattle and goats, whereas the less sacred texts are written on the hides of wild animals like antelope and ibex. As for the languages of the texts, about 80% are in Hebrew, about 17% in Aramaic, which is another Semitic language that had become the main sort of everyday spoken language in the Near East by that time, and about 3% are in Greek. And incidentally, all of the scrolls recovered from Cave 7 are in Greek, which gives the impression perhaps of a library organized by language. And as for their age, which is more ambiguous and has taken a longer time to narrow down, the ages of the scrolls were estimated first based on paleography and comparisons of the writing to surviving inscriptions on stone and ceramics, and also scrolls from Egypt. And they were found to date to about 200 BC to AD 100. In other words, as we said, the late Second Temple or intertestamental period. And this was later reconfirmed by carbon dating and other methods. A few of the oldest texts from Qumran date from perhaps a bit before 200 BC. These are mainly biblical texts. Possibly the oldest ones include copies of Exodus, Leviticus, and Isaiah. And none of the texts definitely date from any later than about 75 AD, and hence it's a reasonable supposition that this whole collection might have been stashed away during the Jewish revolt in the AD 60s and 70s in order to protect it from destruction by the Romans. As for what these texts actually say, well, it's impossible to catalog the corpus completely because there are so many unique and even mysterious texts that are impossible to categorize exactly. But most of them can be grouped roughly into a few broad categories. So as for biblical texts, as we said before, about 25% of the scrolls are Jewish sacred texts that were later included in the Hebrew Bible. And so hence we call them biblical retrospectively. Although, historically this is an anachronism because at this time it seems there wasn't yet a set biblical canon. But we can label them as biblical. All of the books of the Hebrew Bible are represented somewhere in the corpus other than Esther. And some that seem to have been very important to the authors and collectors of the scrolls exist in many copies. For example, there are 30 copies of Deuteronomy, and also several each of Isaiah, Samuel, and the Psalms. There are also several other so-called apocryphal books, meaning books that were already known from other sources from the ancient world and that were sometimes regarded as sacred among some Jewish or Christian communities, but that did not ultimately make it into the biblical canon. For example, versions of Jubilees and the Wisdom of Sirach, both of which were found in Cave 2, and also the Book of Enoch, which had previously, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, had been only known in copies from Ethiopia, in Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia. But in the Dead Sea Scrolls, earlier copies of the Book of Enoch in Aramaic and Greek were discovered for the first time. These so-called apocryphal books that one finds among the Dead Sea Scrolls tend to concern prophecy and eschatology, meaning the disposition of souls after death or after the end of the world. Now, outside of these biblical and apocryphal texts, the rest are mostly so-called sectarian documents. That's what scholars customarily call them, meaning documents that are completely separate from the received biblical canon and that seem to pertain to the beliefs and practices of a distinct sect within Judaism of that time. And almost all of these, apart from a small handful of exceptions that I'll mention, all of these were totally new and unknown to the modern world before the discovery at Qumran. So what sort of texts are found among this so-called sectarian collection? Well, many of them are exegetical or commentaries upon the scriptures. This is a very common type, and it seems that the group that produced the scrolls called these pesher, singular, or pesharim, plural, and they most often relate to prophecies in a biblical book, most often a prophetic book. And they tend to analyze and comment on these books line by line and relate the prophecies to current events that the people in this group had witnessed. One big example is the Pesher HaHabakuk, or commentary on the book of Habakkuk, which was found intact in Cave 1. There are also long Pesharim on the book of Jeremiah, which seems to have been important to this group. And these Pesharim show how the authors believed that they were living out prophesied events, and they were concerned with their own role in the apocalypse and the end times. And these Pesharim make many references to enemies whom they call Kittim, and who seem to be a barbarian people coming into the Holy Land from the west. And this is widely understood to refer to the Romans. There are also rewritten or reworked biblical books. And these are often called Targum or Apocryphon, meaning hidden book that has been revealed. And one big example is the Genesis Apocryphon, which is composed and narrated from the point of view of the patriarch Abraham. It recounts his flight with his wife Sarah into Egypt and explains why they disguised themselves as a brother and sister. Another Apocryphon recounts the story of Abraham's binding of Isaac, and it gives a more complete narrative and explanation of why God told Abraham to sacrifice his son. And one can see these Targums and Apocryphons as possibly forerunners of what are called midrash, or stories filling in gaps in the biblical canon that were collected by Jews many centuries later. However, possibly the biggest category of texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls is calendrical. So the corpus contains scores of calendars and almanacs which plot out the timing of Jewish holy days and festivals, aligning them with the precise days of the week and month, and also with astronomical events, such that they often read like astrological horoscopes, and perhaps they do reflect a belief in a Babylonian-style astrology. But what is most striking and surprising about these calendar documents is that they employ a purely solar calendar based on a year of 52 weeks and 364 days, as distinct from the traditional Hebrew calendar, which is lunisolar, and which is based on the Babylonian calendar, which aligns the days of the yearly cycle with the cycles of the moon. So this is very strange and new, and it underscores how important dates of the holy days evidently were to this group or sect, perhaps because they wanted to precisely plot out what they saw as prophesied events. And if this group used a different calendar, then from their perspective, the observances by other Jews of holy days were illegitimate because they were all happening on the wrong date. And this could raise the possibility that perhaps this disagreement over the calendar and the dates of holy days was the original reason why they broke away. But really, the main clues that we have as to where this distinct sect originated and why they split off are contained in an important document called the Damascus document. And this is probably the earliest of what I will call the institutional documents, which describe the history and rules and operations of this distinct group or sect. So the Damascus document, if we begin with that one, is one of very few non-biblical texts found in the Qumran corpus that was previously known from another source, because this document had also been found decades earlier among the papers in the Cairo Geniza, which is the term for the sort of back storeroom in the Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo in Egypt, where disused and disintegrating old texts had been stowed away. and which then were examined and transcribed by modern scholars and found to contain literally an enormous storehouse of ancient knowledge from thousands of these old texts. So in the Cairo Geniza, one fragment was found of what was called the Damascus document, and scholars thought that it might possibly be linked to the Karaites, another distinct subgroup of Jews that was known to exist hundreds of years later. And apparently some of the early members of this Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo were Karaites who had migrated to Egypt. So this document talks about the founding of a distinct group, and so it was theorized for a long time that maybe this was about the Karaites. But then, at least 3 copies of the Damascus document were found in Qumran, and they are longer and more complete than the fragment found in Cairo. And the document has long sections of legal principles, homilies, moral teachings, but it starts off at the beginning with a brief historical sketch of the origins of an unnamed group. And this passage reads, quote, "In the age of wrath, 390 years after he had given them into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he visited them, and he caused a plant root to spring from Israel and Aaron, to inherit his land, and to prosper on the good things of his earth. And they perceived their iniquity, and recognized they were guilty men. Yet for 20 years they were like blind men groping for the way. And God observed their deeds, that they sought him with a whole heart, and he raised from them a teacher of righteousness to guide them in the way of his heart." End quote. So it seems, according to this brief account, that there was a period of chaos after the destruction of Solomon's temple by King Nebuchadnezzar. And this period in their accounting lasted 390 years. So that might make sense with the Babylonian exile and perhaps periods of turmoil after that. Now, it's uncertain whether that 390-year figure is literally true or if it's just a sort of random number that's sometimes used to mean a very long time. Some sort of subgroup formed that believed that Judaism was being practiced improperly, that people had fallen into some sort of sin or impropriety, hence they withdrew, they searched for some sort of alternative practice or doctrine, and after 20 years, which might just mean roughly a generation or so, a leader arose whom they call the teacher of righteousness. And the narrative goes on from there and describes the teacher and his followers being attacked and persecuted by a person they call the wicked priest, which presumably was some sort of high priest of the temple at Jerusalem who they considered to be evil and their enemy, and their debate opponent is a dishonest teacher whom they call the spewer of lies. And these are the sort of epithets that are used throughout the Damascus document narrative and then again in other texts found at Qumran. They talk about this teacher of righteousness as a sort of first leader of the group, and their enemies, the wicked priest and the spewer of lies. And finally, the narrative in this document says that this group adhered to a new covenant, or you might say a renewed covenant, a sort of renewal of the ancient agreement between God and the Israelites, and that because they were persecuted, they were forced to withdraw and live in exile in Damascus. So that's why it's called the Damascus document. And again, we don't know whether they literally meant the city of Damascus in Syria, or if it's just a general term for sort of the desert lands out beyond the Jordan River to the east. Okay, so you've got that founding narrative, which is very ambiguous on all points. Then the Damascus document describes rules of conduct for some sort of community, followers of this new covenant and the teacher of righteousness. And it refers to 2 subgroups. There are those who apparently live in a core settlement, and then others who live in camps outside that core settlement. And again, it's ambiguous. Does this mean like literal tent encampments? Or does it mean, it seems more likely it means followers of the group who still lived out there in towns and cities among other Jews. And the rules discuss the norms of marriage and the family for those who live in the camps. It presumes that some children will be born and raised in the group and become members when they are adults. None of this is mentioned for the core group, which suggests that perhaps they were celibate, and new members reportedly entered this group through a system of trial and initiation. So we have the rudimentary sketch here of what might be the sect that actually produced and collected these scrolls. And then this presumably, again, matches up to a group described in another very important, more detailed document called the Serech HaYachad, or Rule of the Community, is how it's often translated. Although that word Yachad, it seems in Hebrew means more like unity or union. And some people may be familiar with the word from, for example, the Jewish hymn, Hine Matov Umanayim Shevet Achim Gam Yachad. How good and sweet it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. So in this document, we are given a bit of the rules and structure of a group that simply called itself Hayachad, the Unity. And it was found in over 10 copies in several different caves around Qumran. So it apparently was very important. This document does not give any history or backstory, so it's not entirely clear how it relates to the story in the Damascus document. But it does describe a group of people living and eating together, which is very important. And they are enjoined to observe strict rules of purity, which must be followed exactly in order to get access to the communal meals of the group, which are called the pure food. So there's a sort of redemptive, even mystical power to this pure food, which the community shares. The group is initiatory and communistic. One must go through 2 years of probation and then be initiated. And when joining, one must pledge never to eat outside food from anyone outside the group. And breaking these rules of the community can mean punishments like reduced rations or, in the worst case, expulsion, which by implication will lead then to starvation because you cannot get food from anyone outside the community. When joining the group, one must hand over one's money and property to a custodian, and all goods are shared in common. And it seems the group is governed by a tiered organizational structure. On one level, there is the General Assembly of All, which gathers to hear teachings and debate decisions. Hence, it could not have been a very large group, because it seems they were expected to be able to meet in one place. Then there is also a sort of standing committee of 12 elders, and then this is presided over by 3 priests of the Zadok line, meaning they are priests who are believed to be legitimately descended from the high priest Zadok of the time of King David. And among those 3, there is one sort of elder teacher who seems to fill in as sort of the successor of the teacher of righteousness. This Serech HaYachad makes no mention of marriage, women, or sex. And we don't know exactly what that means. Perhaps this group was celibate. Maybe it was all male. But this is not made explicit. Also, alongside the Serech HaYachad, other books of discipline have been found that deal with specific situations, like what to do with people in mourning, and when to allow them from a state of mourning back into the full communion of the community. And finally, a very striking and unusual document, which was found later and was not published for many decades, is called Miksat Ma'aseh HaTorah, or for short, MMT, and that is translated basically as some precepts of the Torah. Sounds very unassuming, but it's actually a really remarkable and strange document, and it sets out a series of rulings and precepts for maintaining ritual purity for sacrifices, including sacrifices at the temple. For instance, it forbids Gentiles from making sacrifices at the temple. It also lays out rules for exactly how to slaughter and sacrifice the red heifer, which is considered a particularly sacred animal, only to be sacrificed at the temple. And at points, it explicitly contrasts the views of the authors of this text, who are simply called we believe this, we do this, and contrast them with some other group simply called they, who apparently are more lax about these purity rules. So this suggests that perhaps these disagreements about ritual purity might be part of the root of why this sectarian group split off from other Jews. And one particularly interesting precept in MMT that is among the most intact is a ruling on whether streams of liquid being poured are contaminated by the vessel that they are poured into. So this is the ruling number 16, and the translation reads, quote, "Concerning streams of liquid, we have determined that they are not intrinsically pure. Indeed, streams of liquid do not form a barrier between the impure and the pure, for the liquid of the stream and that in its receptacle become as one liquid," end quote. So I think what this is basically saying is that impurity and contamination can actually flow upstream. If water or milk or whatever, or oil, flows out of a pure vessel into an impure one, the pure vessel gets contaminated, sort of retroactively. And, this can seem incredibly anal retentive to see things this way, but it seems that this group really cared about this, and if one really thought that this was the case, it is actually not trivial. It's enormously consequential, because if you think of the temple, it had these vessels like the Brazen Sea set out around the temple court, and if people are coming with unclean vessels or even unclean hands and getting fluids from these sacred vessels, then everything's getting contaminated. And probably within a matter of hours, the whole temple is being profaned. So this seems to have been very important to them. Now, alongside these legal and institutional documents, there are many wisdom teachings, similar to books that ended up in the Bible, like Job. A number of them are so-called testaments, or reported last words of various figures like the patriarchs in the Bible. There are also many liturgical texts, including scrolls collecting previously unknown psalms. Some of these are labeled as royal psalms, perhaps meaning that they were attributed to King David. I wish I could read you some of these, but they're so fragmented that they're really impossible to follow. And also it's significant that this group seems to have cared a lot about the psalms because they were traditionally associated with the temple as well. There are other scrolls with many hymns and prayers, one of them being the so-called Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, which is significant for two reasons. One, it suggests that this group actually performed sacrifices on the Sabbath. Another is that this same text was later found in another place, namely at Masada, the fortress just further south down the coast of the Dead Sea, which became the last holdout of the Zealots. And this is one clue that suggests to some people a possible link between the Qumran group or the scroll group and the Zealots. There's also a much longer, almost complete scroll called the Hodayot, or Songs of Thanksgiving. And this is interesting because not all scholars are very impressed with the literary merit of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But all of them, even the skeptics, seem to agree that at the least the Hodayot show poetic beauty and artistry. And for example, one passage that's been quoted is, quote, "The wicked of the people rush against me with their afflictions, and all the day long they crush my soul. But you, O my God, turn the tempest to a whisper, and the life of the distressed you have brought to safety, as a bird from the snare, and as prey from the power of lions," end quote. So a lot of that passage can sound fairly cliche, if you've read the Psalms, for instance. But even still, there are these pithy turns of phrase, like turning the tempest to a whisper, that make the Hodayot stand out. There's also a huge variety of mystical and prophetic texts. There are magical incantations for warding off demons and other purposes. There are visionary hymns like the so-called Chariots of Glory, which seem like forerunners of what would later be known as the Merkabah mystical tradition, based on visionary journeys on a chariot into the celestial realms. There are texts dealing with good and evil souls, which seems to have been very important to the scroll group. So most versions of the rule of the community include a so-called instruction on the two spirits, which teaches a whole metaphysical doctrine of good and evil principles and good and evil souls, which are always intermixed and in conflict within each individual. So I'll read to you some of this instruction on the two spirits. From the God of knowledge comes all that is and shall be. Before ever they existed, he established their whole design, and when as ordained for them they came into being, it is in accord with his glorious design that they accomplish their task without change. The laws of all things are in his hand, and he provides them with all their needs. He has created man to govern the world, and has appointed for him two spirits in which to walk until the time of his visitation, the spirits of truth and of injustice. Those born of truth spring from a fountain of light, but those born of injustice spring from a source of darkness. All the children of righteousness are ruled by the Prince of Light, and walk in the ways of light. But all the children of injustice are ruled by the angel of darkness, and walk in the ways of darkness. The angel of darkness leads all the children of righteousness astray, and until his end, all their sin, iniquities, wickedness, and all their unlawful deeds are caused by his dominion, in accordance with the mysteries of God. The nature of all the children of men is ruled by these two spirits, and during their life all the hosts of men have a portion of their divisions, and walk in their ways. And the whole reward for their deeds shall be for everlasting ages, according to whether each man's portion in their two divisions is great or small. So if we break there, this might sound somewhat reminiscent of the teachings of Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and later outgrowths like Catharism, which teach of warring good and bad and light and dark principles. But the big difference here is that those other dualist philosophies say that the spirit is light and the body is darkness, and the spirit is good and the body is evil, and the spirit must escape the body. This is very different. This is some totally different Jewish variation on that theme, which says that there are two principles, but they're both spiritual. There's a good spirit and a bad spirit, and these two spirits are at war in each person. And furthermore, there's an apocalypticism, that these two spirits within each person will eventually be taken up in a sort of world battle. And it goes on to say, quote, "For God has established the spirits in equal measure until the final age, and has set everlasting hatred between their divisions. But in the mysteries of his understanding and in his glorious wisdom, God has ordained an end for injustice, and at the time of the visitation he will destroy it forever." End quote. Now, in addition to this passage in the rule of the community, there are other texts that supplement it and that describe physiognomies, physical types of faces and bodies that correspond to different measures or proportions of good and evil. So if a person looks like this, they're tall and thin, their toes look like this, then they're 8 parts good, 1 part evil. If this person has this body shape or this hair type, then they are 6 parts evil, 3 parts good, etc., which, is this incredible, weird, it's like a proto-phrenology of good and bad. But it extends this theme that this dualism of the scroll group is very different from Manichaean dualism. So rather than good spirit and bad body, rather there is good spirit and bad spirit, and there is good body and bad body. And the different good and bad body types are related to different proportions of good and bad spiritual nature. Okay, and then many of these moral texts and prophetic texts and mystical texts are also messianic. They make frequent reference to a prophesied Messiah or anointed leader and redeemer, often in very metaphysical terms. So for example, there is text 4Q521, also called the Messiah of Heaven and Earth, which begins saying, quote, "The heavens and the earth will obey his Messiah, and all that is in them. He will not turn aside from the commandments of the holy ones. Take strength in his service, you who seek the Lord. Shall you not find the Lord in this, all you who wait patiently in your hearts? For the Lord will visit the pious ones, or chasidim, and the righteous, or tzaddikim, he will call by name. Over the meek will his spirit hover, and the faithful will he destroy by his power. He shall glorify the pious ones, chasidim, on the throne of the eternal kingdom. He shall release the captives, make the blind see, raise up the downtrodden. Forever I will cling to him, and I will trust in his piety and his goodness, etc., etc. So this messianic theme runs through many of the texts in the corpus, and finally there are explicitly apocalyptic and eschatological texts, and there are many fragments that discuss a coming apocalypse, a possible redemption, resurrection of the dead, and so on. But the two really big ones are the War Scroll and the Temple Scroll. And the War Scroll is intact and came out of Cave 1. It was one of the first scrolls that the Bedouin shepherds found. And it describes a coming actual literal war of good and evil. And it contains even quite detailed battle plans and strategies that it seems that the scroll group should employ in this final war. And then the Temple Scroll was one of the last texts to be found out of Cave 11. It is the longest one, and it describes in great detail the layout and workings of an ideal temple on Mount Zion that apparently ought to be built as the next phase of Israel's exaltation and preparation for the apocalypse. But as grandiose as it is, this is still not the temple's final form. It apparently will be destroyed and replaced in the final apocalyptic war. And based on the description in this scroll, scholars have tried to reconstruct what would be the actual layout and dimensions of this temple. And apparently it would be about half the size of the entire city of Jerusalem as it existed at that time. So it's really a grand vision. Now, finally, there are, you could say, miscellaneous other unique texts, which I can't get into, but one that should be mentioned that is totally unique is the Copper Scroll, which was found alone in Cave 3, quite far to the north of Qumran. And it's unclear how it relates to the other Dead Sea Scrolls. Perhaps it was completely separate. It's a rolled up piece of copper, and it took years for scholars to find a way to unroll it and read it. And it records the supposed hiding places and burials of hoards of treasure, including precious ritual objects, adding up to several tons of gold and silver. And it was initially supposed when the Copper Scroll was read that it must be metaphorical. These couldn't be literal treasure burials. But later scholars tend to think that it may be real after all. And the scholar John Marco Allegro actually undertook expeditions to try to find these treasure hoards, but came up empty-handed. Okay, so if that is what is in the actual collection, the question then is, of course, where did these scrolls come from? Who composed them, collected them, and put them in these caves, and why? And this has been a subject of tremendous controversy, disputation, and confusion. So we can see pretty clearly, for one thing, this collection implies the existence of some distinct subgroup in Jewish society in the late Second Temple period. And furthermore, some of them, like the rule of the community in the Damascus document, explicitly refer to some sort of sectarian group that separated itself out from mainstream Jewish society. So it stands to reason that that group alluded to in those documents are the scroll group, as I'll call them, the people who made the scrolls and put them in the caves. Now, who were they? Well, two clues stood out early on and were pointed out fairly quickly after the first scrolls were discovered in the 1940s. And those are, firstly, the fact that the caves where the scrolls were found are clustered, some of them quite closely, around Khirbet Qumran, that set of ruined building foundations just above Wadi Qumran. So of course it seemed likely that the scrolls were somehow connected to that ruined building complex. Perhaps the scroll group had lived there or even produced the scrolls there. And hence a team was organized in the 1950s to start excavating Khirbet Qumran. The other major clue that scholars pointed out very quickly was a passage in the book Historia Naturalis by the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, where he describes in part the geography of Palestine based on secondhand reports that he had. And in discussing the area around the Dead Sea, which he calls the Asphalt Lake, he writes, quote, "Lying on the west of Asphalt Lake and sufficiently distant to escape its noxious fumes are the Essenes. This is a people," and he uses the Latin word gens, meaning something like nation or tribe. "This is a people that lives apart from the world, and that is amazing beyond all others throughout the whole world. For they have no women among them, they are strangers to sexual desire, they have no money, and they only have palm trees as companions. Day after day, however, their numbers are fully replenished by numerous strangers that come to them, driven there by storms of fortune to adopt their way of life. In this way, through thousands of ages, incredible to relate, this people sustains its existence forever without a single birth taking place there. The weariness of others' lives is a very fruitful source of its population." End quote. So, this passage in Pliny seems to situate the settlement of a celibate male group living in isolation west of the Dead Sea, the same area that includes Qumran. So, based on these clues, Roland de Vaux and his team of archaeologists and other scholars soon developed a theory, basically that the scrolls were produced by the Essenes, who lived in the building complex that is now known as Khirbet Qumran. And this becomes a common theory, one might say the orthodox theory, among the Dead Sea Scrolls editorial team. So to be clear, this standard theory about the scrolls, which you'll still often see in books and documentaries, this is a tripartite theory. So to spell things out, there are three groups of people here on the table, each of which we know existed from different sets of evidence. Firstly, there's the scroll group, the people who produced, collected, and hid the Dead Sea Scrolls. Secondly, the Khirbet Qumran group, the people who lived and worked at Khirbet Qumran. And thirdly, the Essenes, this ascetic sect of Jews who are mentioned and described by three ancient writers whose texts survive. Pliny in his Natural History, which I quoted, the Jewish philosopher Philo, who discusses them briefly, and the Jewish historian Josephus, who describes them in his book Antiquities of the Jews. So this standard theory of the scrolls holds that all three of these groups, the scroll group, the Khirbet Qumran group, and the Essenes, are in fact one and the same. And that, in short, the Essenes lived at Qumran and they produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, hence, to break this down so we can understand the strengths and weaknesses of this theory rests on a sort of triangle of three interlocking identifications. 1. The authors of the scrolls were the Essenes. 2. The authors of the scrolls lived and worked at Khirbet Qumran. And 3. The Essenes lived at Khirbet Qumran. Now, there are significant reasons to believe that each of these identifications is true. And beginning with de Vaux's excavations at Qumran in the 50s, various clues and pieces of evidence were assembled to support these identifications. But to start with the first one, the scroll sect were the Essenes. Well, if one looks at the descriptions of the Essenes that survive in Pliny, Philo, and Josephus, we see certain claims that are made about them one or more times. Namely, that they had a years-long admission process, starting with a 1-year introductory period, then followed by 2 years as a novice member, which could be seen to correspond to the 2-year trial period that's referred to in the Damascus document. Secondly, they held their property in common. They were communistic. They focused on mental purification rather than sacrifices at the temple. They generally avoided taking part in the temple rites. They followed their own distinctive rites of purification. They were celibate. And as we saw, the Damascus document does say that those who, quote, walk in perfect righteousness, who maybe comprise that stricter core group, did not marry or have children. The Essenes had their own rules of discipline and could expel their members. And there are even some similarities going down to the fine details of their rules and practices, such as the rule against spitting when in the assembly. That's also mentioned by Josephus about the Essenes, and it appears in the Serach HaYachad. Okay, secondly, the claim that the scroll sect lived and worked at Khirbet Qumran. So for this, it begins with the simple proximity. Most of the scrolls were found in caves around the edges of the platform that also supports Khirbet Qumran. The biggest cache of all is in Cave 4, which is only a few hundred yards from the building complex, and which was full of fragments. And hence, in this way, one might speculate it might have constituted a kind of geniza, a place to stow away old, worn-out sacred texts. It is the right time frame. So from excavations, it was found that Khirbet Qumran was inhabited during the Second Temple period, from roughly about 150 BC, that was Roland de Vaux's initial estimate, up until the First Jewish War. And that is contemporaneous when it seems most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. The site also was evidently destroyed in the First Jewish War, and then was briefly used by Roman troops. And this too accords with the notion that had already been theorized that the scrolls were hidden away in the caves around Qumran in anticipation of Roman attack. Also, fragments of pottery were found in Khirbet Qumran that closely match the style and materials of the vases in the caves. The scrolls, as we've seen, emphasize ritual purity, and the complex at Khirbet Qumran has several large cisterns and pools, some of which clearly were mikvehs, sort of stepped pools used for ritual purifying ablutions in Jewish practice. Also, as for the buildings in the complex, most of the rooms are very large, as if for communal use. There are hardly any small private rooms. And among those large communal rooms is one that Roland de Vaux identified as a refectory, using an analogy with a Christian monastery, where there's one large, long dining hall. Also, just east of the complex, down the slope of the desert plain closer to the Dead Sea, there is a large cemetery with well over 1,000 burials. And this suggests a sizable community living there at the complex over a period of years. And also, finally, one collapsed room in the complex was found to have in it 3 long, low tables finished in plaster and 2 inkwells, one of them made of bronze. And the archaeological team identified this as a scriptorium, again using this term from monastic life, and it's the word for the room for writing and copying sacred texts. So for many people, this was enough to seal the deal, to show that Khirbet Qumran was the home of an ascetic Essene community that also produced and collected the library that was then hidden away in the caves. And then thirdly, the last identification, that Khirbet Qumran was the home of Essenes. Well, firstly, as we saw, it fits nicely with the location of the Essenes identified by Pliny, namely the desert on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Also, the Essenes reportedly refused to take part in temple sacrifices and instead did their own in their own dwelling places. And in Khirbet Qumran, there were found buried jars of animal bones, which seem as if they might have been interred after sacrificial meals. Now, an immediate problem for identifying Khirbet Qumran as the home of the Essenes is that it's quite small. It's not much bigger than a small village, whereas Josephus describes the Essenes as being one of the 3 main parties in Jewish society, alongside the Sadducees, who focused on temple worship in Jerusalem, and the Pharisees, who focused on study of scripture and the practice of Jewish law in the home. So hence, it doesn't seem as if the Essenes could have fit at such a small site as Khirbet Qumran. It only had space, and more importantly, based on the waterworks, it seems that they only could have had enough water to support a population of about 150 to 200 people. And there's just no way that such a tiny community as that would have been noticed by these three different ancient writers. And so scholars have reconciled this by saying that Khirbet Qumran was a headquarters or mother house for a larger Essene sectarian network. There also are things that don't appear at Khirbet Qumran. There's a lack of personal adornments like jewelry, and arguably the simplicity and uniformity of the pottery there, which was plain and seems to have been made in pottery kilns on the site. And these suggest a lack of luxury, a sort of plainness and self-sufficiency in keeping with the descriptions of the Essenes. And so basically the scholarly consensus at mid-century was that these three groups were all one and the same, and that the main lingering question was simply where did they come from and why did they withdraw into the desert? And so the theory has often been further elaborated to address this question, and the usual answer is to argue that the Essenes first formed during the Hasmonean period in the 100s BC, specifically when this dynasty of Israelite kings, the Maccabees, claimed the title of high priest of the temple. And we know from the book of Maccabees that some Israelites rejected this claim by the kings of the title of high priest. They saw it as an illegitimate usurpation because the Maccabees were not descended from Zadok, that original high priest in the time of David and Solomon that I mentioned before. And so they saw the temple cult under the domination of these royal high priests as corrupted and illegitimate. And the common theory holds then that some objectors withdrew from Jerusalem into the desert, and these became the Essenes, and these then further produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. And if we look in the content of the Dead Sea Scrolls, as we said, there is this wicked priest figure who is one of their main enemies. And the theory holds that this was one of these Hasmonean high priests who came from the Maccabean line, not the Zadok line. And furthermore, they intended, it seems, to stay in the desert until the usurpers were gone and the legitimate priesthood was restored, which would then allow them to return to Jerusalem and expand the temple. Okay, sounds so far so good, right? Well, what are the reasons for doubts? So over the course of the 70s and especially the 80s, as this controversy over control of the scrolls was escalating, some of these outside scholars also began criticizing this Essene theory and pointing out reasons to doubt and question it. So firstly, reasons to doubt the connection between the scrolls and the Essenes. Well, there are a number of differences that separate the scroll group, as we can reconstruct it, from the Essenes. For one thing, the rule of the community, which seems to have been the really important, often reproduced handbook of the group, never explicitly says that the community were celibate. This has only been inferred from sort of oblique implications in the Damascus document, and maybe it's an incorrect inference which people have made in order to liken them to the Essenes, right? It's an instance of when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Also, there were women and children found in the cemetery. So this gets very complicated and hairy. When one looks at that cemetery, it seems that it has two basic halves, a sort of western half and an eastern half. And a small number, a few dozen graves have been excavated in both parts of the cemetery. And in the western part, it seems that most of the graves were of middle-aged men, but at least two were women. And then in the eastern part, there's more of an even sort of mix of men, women, and children. So you could say, all right, well, maybe the western part represents the celibate core group, and then the eastern part belonged to the sort of wider group of affiliates. But even in the western part, there are at least two women, and that's just from the small sample of graves that were excavated, and it's very unlikely that any more can ever be excavated because there's a strong taboo against disturbing graves in Judaism. Okay, so some women and children were found in the cemetery. We can say that much. Perhaps one can accommodate that or explain it away, or perhaps it undermines this theory. Another, and arguably more powerful objection, is that the scroll group was not pacifist. So the Essenes are described as strictly pacifist and nonviolent. Well, one of the first scrolls found in Cave 1 is the War Scroll, which describes elaborate plans and preparations for a coming war, which again seems to have been understood as a real war that was really going to happen. It was not just a spiritual war in heaven. And furthermore, it seems as if the people at Khirbet Qumran did take part in a war in the first Jewish revolt. Why else would the Romans have attacked and destroyed most of the complex? And finally, another objection is that the Essenes disavowed slavery and refused to hold slaves. Well, according to the rule books found at Qumran and other surviving records, the scroll group did own slaves. Okay, so the link between the scrolls and the Essenes is looking rather shaky now. Secondly, reasons to doubt the connection between the scrolls and the site of Khirbet Qumran. So there's actually a great deal of uncertainty around the dating of when the site was occupied and inhabited. So when Roland de Vaux oversaw those first excavations in the 50s, he did not use strict methods of stratigraphy, of recording and reconstructing the layers. And so the standards in that way were lower than they would be in a contemporary excavation. And later archaeologists argue that he overestimated how early the site was inhabited, and that in fact it was only inhabited around 100 BC or even later. And if that's the case, then the timing actually doesn't line up as well with the scrolls, which seem to go back all the way to the 200s BC. So again, perhaps de Vaux was trying to sort of push things back. There was a bias there, trying to push things back earlier to make the site fit better with the scroll corpus, when in fact it doesn't line up all that well. Another reason to doubt it is that there are no footpaths that can be found running between the complex and the scroll caves, and hence there was no long-term shuttling back and forth between them. And so there's no necessary archaeological reason to think that the people in the complex went to the caves or used the caves. Thirdly, there are a lot of mikvahs, that is true, which suggests a concern with ritual purity, and so in a broad, loose sense that might connect them to the contents of the scrolls. But the scrolls, again, do not specifically discuss mikvahs. They're a lot more concerned with conduct around the table and the food. So the connection here is still pretty loose, and one could say that the mikvahs maybe just, there were a lot of them, as a way of keeping cool in the desert heat, and a way of backup way of conserving and saving more water, which was a vital resource in the desert. Who knows? Also, the Damascus scroll does say that the followers of the teacher of righteousness who started their group went into exile in Damascus. And again, maybe that's just a metaphor, but it says Damascus, and that's pretty far from Qumran. Another very important point, which has really tipped opinion for some scholars, is the analysis of the handwritings in which the scrolls are written. They've been found to have been written by hundreds of different scribal hands, and hence they were not produced by a small team of scribes ensconced at a small isolated community and working in their scriptorium. Rather, it seems they were produced by many different scribes over many years, probably in different places from which they then had to be gathered. And probably they were mostly produced, realistically, in Jerusalem, where most of the skilled scribes and scholars were seated. And lastly, subsequent archaeology has argued that the room with the 3 low tables that Roland de Vaux identified as a scriptorium was more likely a triclinium, meaning a Roman-style dining room, which traditionally had 3 long, low benches on which diners could recline while eating from a central table. And this design was common among Romans and also was adopted by Second Temple period Jews. You might know it's even referred to in the Passover Seder, when the congregants say we should recline because we are free people. Okay. Thirdly, reasons to doubt the purported link between the Khirbet Qumran site and the Essenes. So I mentioned the burials of animal bones, which were theorized to be the results of sacrificial meals. Well, those might have just been buried around the site for mundane reasons, like not wanting to attract scavenging animals. There also are extensive signs of wealth at the site, such as fine glassware and many, many coins. A great number of high-value coins from all through the Second Temple and Roman period, which conflicts with the claims that the Essenes were ascetic and eschewed wealth. And then there's a final problem with this identification, which is, again, the complex is just too small, even to be a supposed mother house. So it was initially thought that perhaps only some people lived within the building complex itself, whereas others were in encampments around the complex and shared the water supply. But the area has been thoroughly scoured and excavated. There were no other encampments around. There was only this building complex, which had space to house only about 50 people. So what significance could that have? It doesn't even seem big enough to house the group described in the scrolls, let alone a major party of Jewish society as described by Josephus. So for this reason, many scholars in recent years have argued that Khirbet Qumran was something smaller and much more mundane, such as a country retreat or villa for a wealthy clan. This would make a lot of sense with the triclinium dining room. It could have been a small military lookout or outpost. This is what people usually thought it was before the scrolls were discovered, and perhaps that's still what makes the most sense. It is perched on a spot overlooking the north end of the Dead Sea, which could have been militarily useful. Excavations have also shown that the complex had a 3-story tower in the north, which could have been a good lookout, and the extensive cisterns might have been there to help withstand a military siege. And lastly, some have argued that it was a commercial trading outpost, and it's been found that there was a wharf on the shore of the Dead Sea at the mouth of Wadi Qumran, and the site could have been used to trade bitumen, balsam, dates, other local products, remnants of which have been found around the site. And most of all, it had extensive pottery kilns, and so it might have been a pottery production and sale outpost. And if this is the case, this then suggests a very different possibility and explanation for why the Dead Sea Scrolls are there. Perhaps the scroll sect did not live at Qumran at all, but rather they gathered the scrolls from other places around Judea, especially Jerusalem, and then brought them to Qumran to stow in the desert caves, and they simply stopped at Khirbet Qumran in order to buy the ceramic vessels in which to stow them away. Just another hypothesis. And now, finally, there are also reasons to doubt the theorized backstory about where the Essenes or scroll group came from. So that theory claims that the Essenes or scroll group broke away because they rejected the Hasmonean rulers and their usurpation of the office of high priest. But nowhere in the scrolls do they say that the wicked priest was wicked because he was from the wrong ancestral line of descent, or that he was a usurper, nor do they say that he was a ruler. None of these things are a concern. Rather, he is wicked because he persecutes the teacher of righteousness and rejects his teachings. It's a doctrinal dispute. And furthermore, there is now reason to think that the scroll group was perfectly fine with the Hasmonean rulers and was sometimes friendly towards them. And there has been found one hymn in praise of King Jonathan, who was a Hasmonean king of the early 1st century BC, who also served as high priest. So all in all, in sum, there are serious reasons to doubt that the scroll sect lived at Qumran, that they were Essenes, or that they broke away because of a dispute over the high priesthood. But if we don't accept those theories, then of course we have to ask, then who were the scroll sect? Where did they come from? And what was their agenda? So various alternative theories have been put forward over about the last 40 years about who the scroll sect were and what they were up to. And these include that they were Sadducees, that they were zealots, and that they were Christians. So just to briefly consider where these theories come from, what they're trading on. As for the idea that they were Sadducees, we do see in the scrolls a tremendous investment in ritual purity, including at the temple. And this is exemplified most of all in MMT, or some precepts of the Torah, which lays out the group's disputes with an opposing party. And scholars have found that the scroll sect's positions, as represented in MMT, fit most closely with what is recorded of the Sadducees. And also, like the Sadducees, it seems that they were perfectly fine or even friendly with the Hasmonean kings and did not object to their holding the high priesthood. And then there is the Copper Scroll. So, as I said, it's widely thought now that the Copper Scroll is in earnest, that it is really describing the supposed sites of real treasure burials. Well, where could all of that valuable treasure have come from, and why would it have been stashed in the desert? Realistically, it could only have come from the temple, the most lavish, beautified building in Judea. And why would they have hidden it? For the same reason that the scroll group hid their scrolls. They were trying to protect it from Roman raiding. So hence, it seems the scroll group, by this reasoning, was linked to the temple and even had access to the sacred objects of the temple. Hence, they probably were Sadducees or were closely aligned with them. And it also then stands to reason as well that this enormous library of sacred texts either was or included the library of the temple, which they took out to hide and protect from the Romans. But this too is disputed for many reasons. Other scholars think the temple library was probably very small and that it wouldn't have included all of these sectarian documents like the rule of the community. Okay, second idea, that they were zealots. Well, there is evidence that this was a pretty militaristic group, as evidenced for one thing by the war scrolls, and it does seem that they went down fighting. There was a serious battle and destruction at Khirbet Qumran around 70 AD. So if we suppose that Khirbet Qumran is connected to the scroll group, then it does seem that they were a fighting group. And also there is that link I mentioned before to Masada, the fact that the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, this same document, was found at Qumran and also Masada, this fortress site further south, which was known to be the final holdout of the Zealots. Now, thirdly, there is the notion that has been floated several times that they were Christians, and this is maybe the shakiest and the most controversial, but it keeps coming up because it's sort of an irresistible thought. It would be such a bombshell to show that these documents were in fact Christian. So many scholars have tried in different ways, often using very flimsy arguments, to link the scrolls to Christianity. For example, in 1956, the scholar John Marco Allegro, who was on the editorial team, claimed to have in his possession a scroll saying that the wicked priest had arrested the teacher of righteousness, given him over to Gentile soldiers, and then the teacher was crucified, but his followers took him down from the cross and stood watch over his tomb, expecting him to rise from the dead. So had this been real, it would seem to be a smoking gun, that the story of Christ had in fact originated from this Qumran sect, and hence in this way could totally rewrite the prehistory of Christianity. And his claim caused a splash in the media. But when other scholars asked him, "Where is this scroll? Can we see this passage?" he never answered, but dropped the whole thing. So was Allegro just lying? Was this wishful thinking? Was he reading things into some texts that just weren't there? Who knows? A bit later, another scholar named Jose O'Callaghan claimed that he had located a fragment of the Gospel of Mark among the Dead Sea Scrolls. But when this fragment was examined, it was tiny and had only a few stray characters and only one complete word, namely the word kai, meaning and. So obviously it was a sort of desperate stretch to try to claim that this represented a Christian document in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So usually this whole idea that the Dead Sea Scroll group is going to be unmasked as early Christians or proto-Christians, it's always fallen flat. But nonetheless, there is the matter of the messianism in the scrolls, which is very real and prevalent. Now, belief in a coming Messiah was not at all unusual in Judaism at this time or later. But still, there are titles and powers attributed to the Messiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls that do sound very close to how the Gospels described Christ, more so than any other known Jewish texts. For example, the Messiah is frequently called the Son of God, which is a bit ambiguous in Hebrew. Does that mean literally begotten son, or does it mean servant or follower? But also the Messiah is said to deliver prophecies, to bring good news to the poor and the oppressed, and to raise the dead. So all of this is suggestive that maybe they were Christians, but more likely they were not actually Christians, but rather they reflect a growing and evolving stream of messianism in the Second Temple period that has previously been largely unknown, but that influenced Christianity, or you could say is the sort of matrix, the ferment that Christianity arose out of. So I'll go back to this a bit later. There are important implications you can see from the Dead Sea Scrolls for Christianity, but that does not necessarily mean that they were Christians. Okay, so finally, with all of these contrary ideas and arguments and counter-arguments up in the air, what are some important things that we can take away from the Dead Sea Scrolls, even amidst all of this paradox and uncertainty? Well, firstly, just to address that lingering question of who were the scroll group, and were they Essenes? Well, in my estimation, I would say no, we should not say that they were Essenes. The connections are too loose, there are too many significant differences and discrepancies. You really have to selectively pick and choose the claims in the ancient texts about the Essenes to try to make them match up to what we know about the scroll group. And furthermore, we really don't know how accurate our surviving descriptions of the Essenes are in the first place. So I think it's better to simply say that they were some unidentified group, and we should simply call them, as I have done, the scroll group, or as others have said, the New Covenant group. Now, a counter-argument that's been put forward by some, like John J. Collins in the book The Dead Sea Scrolls, a Biography, the counter-argument is that they must be Essenes because they were clearly a very extensive group with a lot of resources, manpower, and an extensive reach in Jewish society in order to assemble a library like this. So therefore, it's impossible that chroniclers like Josephus would not have taken note and mentioned them in their writings. So Collins's argument is that they had to be a major sect in Jewish society. It's impossible that Josephus et al. Would simply not have mentioned them. And so they must be one of the three main groups outlined in Josephus's book, the closest match, of course, being the Essenes. Now, I don't think that this argument holds up. One has to ask, firstly, just how exhaustive and reliable do you think Josephus's account is? Are we sure that he included every significant group in Judea in that time? And if we suppose, as Collins argues, that the scroll sect were the Essenes, then why would Josephus have missed the scroll sect's most crucial and salient feature that set them apart from the rest of the Jewish world? This wasn't the fact that they withdrew into the desert. Others did so, like the Zealots and the John the Baptist group. It wasn't that they were celibate. There is no proof, either archaeologically or in the texts, that they were celibate. Rather, it was the calendar. As we can see from the scroll corpus, this was their big obsession, and this is what set them at odds with other Jews. And one indication of this is a story about the teacher of righteousness, the mythic founder of the group, and his adversary, the wicked priest, which is recounted in the Pesher HaHabakuk, or commentary on the book of Habakkuk. And this story says that while the teacher of righteousness was observing the Day of Atonement, or as it's called, Yom Kippur, the wicked priest came, sought him out, confronted, and attacked him. And this can seem very shocking to read. Why would a Jewish priest do this sort of dirty work of seeking out and attacking his adversary on Yom Kippur, the most solemn day of fasting and prayer in the Jewish calendar? Well, the obvious answer is that for the priest, it wasn't Yom Kippur. He was using the conventional Hebrew calendar, and hence we can infer then the reason for this confrontation. From the viewpoint of the priest, the teacher of righteousness and his group were observing Yom Kippur on the wrong day, and hence committing a serious sacrilege. So as this story conveys, the scroll group saw themselves as sort of martyrs, suffering for the sake of righteousness and for the sake of ritual correctness as rooted in their calendar. And this can raise the question of why would they care so much about the calendar? Well, this probably relates to their wider obsession with prophecy and the cycles of time. They were determined to see fulfillments of prophecy as they unfolded in the world. And their calendar was solar, and I think this is not a coincidence. It was solar-based like the Egyptian calendar. And as I discussed in my previous lecture, part 7, about the Antikythera mechanism, the big advantage of a solar calendar like the Egyptians was the ease of calculation across time. It's much simpler to calculate exact dates of distant events in the distant past and the distant future using a simple, unchanging year with a set number of days. That's much simpler than trying to use the Babylonian-style lunisolar calendar. So this was very important and fundamental, it seems, to the scroll group. Yet Josephus makes no mention of the Essenes having their own calendar. And so if we do suppose that Josephus's accounts were accurate and comprehensive, then how could he have missed this crucial difference in practice and doctrine that actually set this sect apart? So the obvious conclusion, I think, is that the scroll group is simply not the one that Josephus and these other authors label as the Essenes. And lastly, to drive this home, we have to note that that very word, Essene, doesn't appear anywhere in these thousands of texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so if in my view they're not Essenes or the connection is too weak to identify them as the Essenes, then who are they? They may have had some similarities to the Essenes, but I think it's evident that they were originally an extreme group of Sadducees who broke away and withdrew. And there are many clues, such as in the MMT or Precepts of the Torah text, the Copper Scroll, etc., that link them to the temple and to the Sadducee party. But nonetheless, they stood out as extremely stringent because they invested these ritual purity laws with spiritual and eschatological meaning. So in other words, they didn't just think that these ritual purity procedures were necessary for the efficacy of temple sacrifices, but that they related these purity rites to the spiritual war between the good and evil principles. So when and why did they break away from the Sadducees and the temple cult? Well, as we have seen, it was not because the Hasmoneans took over the high priesthood, which it doesn't seem was really an issue for them. It never comes up in the scrolls. Rather, it was because of how the temple was being run at some point in time, and the fact that in their view it was being corrupted. So in the scrolls, we see that the enemies of the scroll group are not only the wicked priest, but also another opponent called the spewer of lies, presumably an opposing teacher, and his followers, who in the Pesher HaNahum, the commentary on Nahum, are called, quote, those who seek after smooth things. So if we look at our known texts, like Maccabees, Josephus, and others, the main opponents of the Sadducees were the Pharisees, those who intensively studied and interpreted the law to be practiced and applied in everyday life, and who at least sometimes found ways of relaxing or softening the ritual purity laws. So I tend to agree with the argument put forward by Wise, Abegg, and Cook in their introduction to their translation of the scrolls. It seems as if the spewer of lies and his followers are probably the Pharisees. And specifically this phrase, those who seek after smooth things, seems to be a play on words. So smooth things in the Hebrew is chalakut, which is sort of almost a homonym to halacha, the law. And so it seems as if this phrase is a sort of double entendre, meaning those who look for loopholes or ways of skirting the law. So then the question is just, at what point might there have been a high priest who aligned with the Pharisees and not the Sadducees? Well, this is fairly straightforward. So in general, through most of the Hasmonean period, the Hasmonean rulers served in the office of high priest, and they were politically aligned with the Sadducees. And indications are the scroll group was fine with this. They had no objection to it. But the exception to this pattern was the reign of the Queen Salome Alexandra from 76 to 67 BC. And she did not claim the office of high priest because she couldn't. And so it seems she instead aligned herself politically with the Pharisees, and she gave them extensive powers, reportedly. And she appointed her son, Hyrcanus II, to the office of high priest. And he reportedly stacked the Sanhedrin council with Pharisees and gave them control over the temple. According to Josephus, furthermore, the Pharisees in this period persecuted, banished, and even killed many of their opponents. So this is probably the point in time when more militant Sadducees became radicalized. They could not accept or accommodate themselves to this Pharisaic hegemony. They were persecuted and suppressed. They withdrew from the temple and from Jerusalem, and they persisted as a militant apocalyptic group, opposing first the Pharisees and then also the Romans, and possibly aligning themselves with the Zealots during the Roman period. So this seems to me like the most likely origin of the scroll group as we know it from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So then, if this seems like the most likely best explanation for the scroll group and their origins, then what does the library of this radical group reveal about Judaism or Christianity more broadly? Well, firstly, as for the text and canon of the Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls illustrate the great variety and dynamic evolution of the scriptures before the canon was fixed. We see so-called biblical and apocryphal books intermingled side by side, and furthermore, important biblical books exist in multiple versions. And as for the text types, so remember I said the received traditional texts of the Hebrew Bible fall into three basic kinds: the Masoretic text, the Samaritan text, and the Greek Septuagint. When we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, the largest portion of them are closest to the Masoretic text, and counts by different scholars vary as to exactly how many can be grouped as Proto-Masoretic, ranging from about 35% to 60%. Meanwhile, smaller fractions of them, about 5 to 15%, are aligned with the Samaritan text and 5% with the Septuagint. The rest, which is a significant portion, ranging, somewhere from 20 to almost 50%, are none of the above. They either align with all three, there's no significant point of difference, or they differ from all three and are totally unique versions found only in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this underscores that this library was probably collected, again, from many different sources in Jerusalem or elsewhere, and were gathered into this library, but they all evidently were treated the same. These many different versions of Deuteronomy, Samuel, Daniel, etc., are all preserved in the same caves, in the same sort of vases, side by side. And so we can see here the scroll group was clearly obsessed with sacred books and texts. They were very much people of the book, but they did not seem to demand a single authoritative text. Perhaps they drew different wisdom, different insights from different versions of these texts. And this shows the great variety and ferment of this Second Temple period. Now, as for all of this bears on Christianity, so as I said, there have been many efforts to link the Dead Sea Scrolls to Christianity, and there's no indication that they were Christians, but there are connections, and there are great similarities between the messianic prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls and early Christian writings about Christ. For one thing, as I mentioned, they use this phrase, Son of God, for the coming Messiah. And also, many have specifically pointed out a passage in the scroll 4Q521, which is a prayer or hymn containing prophecies about a Messiah. I read a passage from it earlier, And this prayer or hymn is quite strange and confusing in a way because it seems to elide the distinction between God and the Messiah, maybe suggesting that the authors saw the Messiah as a divine figure or even a personification of God. And the prayer contains this passage, quote, "The glorious things that have not taken place, the Lord will do, as he said, for he will heal the wounded, give life to the dead, and preach good news to the poor." End quote. So this can be seen to very closely presage a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11. So here John the Baptist sends a messenger to meet with Jesus and to question whether he is the Messiah. And Jesus reportedly responds, quote, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." End quote. So one can see this as almost just an expansion on that passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And furthermore, the implication in the gospel is that John the Baptist will right away understand these miracles and wonders to be prophesied signs of the Messiah. So the scholar John J. Collins, who I mentioned before, points out that both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel of Matthew clearly draw upon passages in the prophet Isaiah, which describe a so-called suffering servant figure. For example, from Isaiah 61, quote, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners." End quote. So one could say, well, both of these later texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel are both pattern on these prophecies in Isaiah. But as Collins points out, Isaiah never explicitly associates this servant figure with the Messiah, and most Jews customarily have not done so. They're considered two separate figures. And that identification had always been understood to be a Christian innovation. But here we see that the Dead Sea Scrolls have that in common with the Gospels, and probably preceded the Gospels in that. And also, what is more, the Isaiah passage that I quoted makes no mention of raising the dead. But both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospel do so. So as Collins argues, it appears that the scroll group and the early Christians were both drawing upon a shared tradition, or one could say, a shared set of ideas about the Messiah, including that he would have the power to raise the dead, and hence would begin the prophesied resurrection. And these sorts of ideas were circulating in a sort of messianic and apocalyptic underground in Judea in the Second Temple period. So these sort of parallels have the effect, you could say, of making Christianity more Jewish. It runs counter to the idea that Christianity is the synthesis of Greco-Roman philosophy with Judaism. And, I've heard this put forward. It always struck me as simplistic and really just wrong. But you still hear this sometimes. Defenders of Christianity sometimes have said this to try to elevate Christianity above its Jewish origins. And also detractors of Christianity have said it in order to cast Christianity as a sort of fraud or imposture, right? There's this continuing quest to somehow unmask the fraud of Christianity. And these will assert that Christ wasn't really a Jewish peasant. He's really a Greco-Roman demigod or a sun deity. He's really Hercules dressed up as a Jew, and his followers are really Pythagoreans, etc., etc. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls refute that and reinforce the fact that Christianity grew out of a Jewish milieu. And while there surely were influences from early on from Greece and Rome, these are not necessary to invoke in order to account for the rise of Christianity or its core teachings. These core early ideas about Christ in the Gospels are Jewish ideas. So you could say this can have the effect of making Christianity Jewish again. Now, what about the implications in turn for Judaism? Well, some might say that the scrolls have the effect of making ancient Judaism appear more strange, more radical, and that's fair enough as far as it goes. But I would say, as a last point from my own perspective, I would say that reading about the specific texts from Qumran, I was struck by how familiar many of them seem in form and in spirit. One example is the MMT text, Some Precepts of the Torah, which schematically lays out a debate over fine points of ritual law between we and they. We do this, they do this. This can sound quite Talmudic, very reminiscent of the later collection of recorded debates, often over tiny arcane points of the law. Rabbi Yohanan says you wait till sundown, Rabbi Eliezer says no, do it earlier, blah, blah, blah. The conventional wisdom in the Jewish world is that this kind of debate is quintessential to rabbinic Judaism, and that the rabbis were the spiritual heirs and successors to the Pharisees. So the supposition is the Pharisees are sort of our forebears. They pioneered this kind of scholarly debate captured in writing, and their form of Judaism is the one that flourished and defined Jewish life after the destruction of the Second Temple, because it was the least dependent upon the temple. Yet if you look in the Dead Sea Scrolls, here is a kind of proto-Talmudic text laying out debates over the application of the law, and specifically to the temple. And it was written and preserved by a group that clearly cared immensely about temple ritual, and in this way were aligned with the Pharisees' opponents, the Sadducees. And similar things could be said, maybe even more so, I would say, of the Pesharim, these commentaries on prophetic books with their line-by-line explications of the meanings of the text. And this is very reminiscent of rabbinical biblical analysis. It may have been more simplistic, more programmatic, but still, looking through it, it comes to my mind, this sounds like what Rashi was doing 1,000 years later. And even when it comes to these apocryphons that rewrite biblical stories with new characters and incidents added in, as I said, this basically seems like midrash, which is the word for mostly medieval Jewish commentaries on the scriptures, which also often include additional stories and characters added in to explain gaps or contradictions in the text. For instance, this is where the story of Lilith, the supposed first woman who preceded Eve, comes from a midrash. So altogether, the scrolls, I think, complicate the idea that the Judaism we have been practicing in the post-Second Temple era derives from the Pharisees, and that these other forms of Jewish life were simply wiped out, and those branches cut off with the destruction of the temple. And it raises the possibility, I think, that aspects of Judaism as we have been practicing it in medieval and modern times might actually have roots in these supposedly long-lost streams of Judaism. So hopefully, all in all, I would hope that this can have the effect of making Judaism weird again, right? So these are my main hopes of what one could take away from the scrolls, that they make Christianity more Jewish again and make Judaism more weird again. So thank you so much for listening, and as I said, this lecture is brought to you by the letter V, so thank you to my current active patrons whose names begin with V: Viggo Johnson, Vicky Turner Malone, and Vasu. Thank you.